It's the most advanced stealth fighter ever developed, capable of defeating any radar ever invented, and it can kill 10 American F-22 Raptors with just one missile, at least if you listen to the Russian Ministry of Defense. But why is an aircraft the Russians claim is more advanced than the American F-22 and F-35 conspicuously absent over the skies of Ukraine, exactly where it's needed the most by Russian forces? The Su-57 is a Russian multi-role fighter that's Russia's first attempt at a fifth-generation aircraft. It was conceived in 1999 after its predecessor, the Mikoil Project 144, proved to be entirely too expensive to actually put into production. The Project 144 was meant to be an answer to America's own F-22, which was at the time nearing completion and initial operational capability. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to an economic crisis and the project struggled to find adequate funding. The MiG-144 would have its maiden flight in February 2000 and then be cancelled shortly after. The Su-57, NATO codename Felon, was meant to build upon the successes of the 144 and field a true fifth-generation fighter. By now, the United States was starting to churn out the F-22 Raptor, and Russia had no answer to this critical threat. But almost inevitably, the Felon ran into its own financial difficulties, and a program that was meant to produce a fleet of fighters by the mid-2000s would only deliver its first operational aircraft in 2020. Russia couldn't afford to produce the Su-57 on its own, though, and troubles began early when Russia and India signed an agreement to co-develop the aircraft in September 2010. As the project evolved, however, Indian engineers voiced serious concerns about the aircraft's capabilities and survivability against American fifth-generation fighters. By 2014, India had lost faith in the Su-57 and formally abandoned the program, leaving Russia to finance it on its own. This immediately put a massive financial strain on Russia, further compounded by sanctions of high-technology goods from the West after its annexation of Crimea. The Su-57 struggled through development, and a fleet once envisioned to consist of over 100 aircraft ended up producing only a dozen or so test models. In 2018, Russia claimed that the Su-57 took part in combat operations in Syria. However, there's no real proof that the jet performed any combat duties in the country. It's very likely then that Russia merely deployed the plane there to fly a few non-combat sorties so as to attempt to rouse interest from foreign investors, a very common tactic by the Russian defense industry. With a poorly diversified economy under pressure from sanctions, Russia relies heavily on foreign buyers to fund its weapons development programs. Despite no verifiable proof of the plane's combat record, Russia claims that it partook in combat operations both in Syria and now in Ukraine, where Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that Su-57s took part in operations to neutralize Ukrainian air defenses, eliminating multiple Ukrainian surface-to-air missile batteries. Since we've all learned that Russia literally never lies ever, this is an impressive feat for an airplane that's technically still in development. What's more impressive about this claim, however, is the fact that the Su-57 is not even believed by Western observers to be a true stealth aircraft, merely one with stealth characteristics. Observers point to difficulties by the Russians in joining panels of the body together tightly enough to reduce radar return, as well as its glaringly non-stealthy engines. The body of the aircraft is also significantly less stealthy than American counterparts, giving off far larger radar returns from the sides and rear. This, however, is in line with the Russian philosophy of operating aircraft only within the safety of ground-based air defenses. The Russians simply couldn't afford to field an all-aspect stealth aircraft, and thus focused only on frontal stealth. The aircraft also appears to lack another quality of a fifth-generation fighter: data link capabilities. While tests are underway to have the Su-57 speak with a drone companion, this is far from the capabilities of the US F-35, which can operate as a sort of mini air control platform in place of traditional AWACS, speaking with a variety of friendly aircraft and helping guide weapons and planes to their targets. However, the Su-57 does have some design advantages over real fifth-generation aircraft in America's arsenal. For one, it's far more maneuverable than any US aircraft, and this is a big clue to the fact that the Russians know this is not a peer to an American fifth-generation fighter. That's because the super maneuverability is not a design feature of a traditional fifth-gen aircraft, which are designed to operate as assassins, not knife fighters. F-35s and F-22s are built to engage enemy targets from beyond visual range with advanced AIM-120D missiles that have ranges in excess of 90 miles. Not only is this missile range outside the range of most other enemy missiles, but the stealth characteristics of an F-22 or F-35 means that an enemy being fired on won't even be able to detect the stealth fighter until it's much, much closer, estimated at about 3 dozen or so miles. With limited internal payloads of 6 to 8 missiles, stealth aircraft should never be involved in a dogfight. Thus, super maneuverability is only desired if you have reason to believe your aircraft will be forced into dogfights. because it's not stealthy enough or has the targeting capabilities to engage in a long-range fight. So while the Su-57 is capable of some truly impressive acrobatic feats, this will be meaningless in over 90% of engagements against an adversary such as the US Air Force. Further giving clues to the fact that the Su-57 is not a true stealth aircraft are its cheek-mounted radars, which allow it to guide missiles to target at far more extreme angles than its American counterparts. This allows the Su-57 to turn further away from its target than an American plane and still maintain a good radar lock. But you only build this capability if you expect your aircraft to have to fight at close ranges where extreme maneuvers are required, or if you expect your aircraft to have to notch or defend against enemy missiles while guiding its own to the target. It's likely the Russian knew from the start the Felon would be detectable at far greater range than US aircraft and would need the ability to maneuver away from incoming missiles while maintaining a lock for its own. Despite this, the Russian Ministry of Defense claims the Su-57 is not just a match, but superior to the F-22 and F-35. If that's the case, then where is Russia's premier aircraft when its army needs it the most in the skies over Ukraine? First, if all claims about the Su-57 are true, Russia simply wouldn't be able to field them in large enough numbers to make much of a difference. Currently, there are only about a dozen or so Su-57s in operation, and most of these are test aircraft not meant for combat duty. This likely only leaves just over half a dozen that could carry weapons to target successfully. But there's no evidence outside of Russian claims that this has actually happened. The best the world can manage is a video of an aircraft with a similar shape to the Su-57 captured on video early in the war carrying out an air-to-ground attack. Most experts agree that if the Su-57 is truly engaged in combat with Ukraine, then it's not seeing frontline duty. Rather, the plane is likely only firing standoff attack munitions at long ranges from the safety of Russian airspace. Armed with the right weapons, the Su-57 could potentially stay out of range of Ukrainian air defenses and destroy them, as claimed by Russia, but there's practically no chance that Russia is willing to risk flying its flagship aircraft over the front lines where it could potentially be shot down, causing Russia heaps of international embarrassment, at least more than it's earned so far. This is doubly true when you consider that Russia also fears Western weapons employed by Ukraine, and knows for a fact that Western nations are feeding a steady diet of intelligence to Ukraine's armed forces. So why is the Su-57 not in operation over Ukraine? First, there's simply not enough of them to be worth employing. Russia has goals of just under 100 of the fighter by 2027, something that is completely unrealistic given extreme Western sanctions against the nation. If your military is having to strip washers and microwaves for microchips, you're not going to be fielding 100 stealth fighters in 5 years. Secondly, the plane was almost certainly not nearly as capable as Russia claims it to be. And the last thing Russia wants is the embarrassment of having one shot down by Ukraine. Russia has lost an estimated 144 aircraft in the war, with 24 of those being frontline manned fighters or ground attack aircraft. The threat environment is too high for Russia to risk the PR disaster that would ensure if a Felon was shot down by the Ukrainians. The Soviet-Afghan War raged for 10 years and killed over 15,000 Russian soldiers. It was a devastatingly costly campaign for the Soviet Union that directly led to its downfall and collapse. On February 24, 2022, Putin said, "Hold my beer," and launched an even worse military disaster. But is Putin's Ukrainian invasion really a failure? Or are we all guilty of falling for Western propaganda, as Russia would claim? Getting good intelligence on the ongoing invasion of Ukraine is difficult, which makes drawing conclusions equally difficult. Wars are very dynamic things, and what starts off blazingly well can end in disaster or quagmire. Just ask the United States after 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. In both cases, U.S. forces utterly decimated the conventional forces of each nation and then spent 20 years fighting an insurgency, only to leave with a strategic defeat that left the situation worse for America than before the invasion. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has had immediate and very large red flags straight from day one that signal this will be one of Russia's worst defeats since the start of World War II. For starters, it's become abundantly clear that Vladimir Putin was operating on very faulty intelligence when he launched the invasion. Shortly before Russian forces moved to staging areas, he tasked his intelligence apparatus with infiltrating Ukraine and bribing or intimidating Ukrainian military and political officials into cooperating with Russia. These intelligence agents were also supposed to take the general temperature of the population in order to gauge whether or not Ukraine could muster the will to fight an invasion. Perhaps unsurprisingly for the Russian dictator, the verdict was exactly what he wanted to hear. Ukraine was not just ready for an invasion, but its population would welcome Russian soldiers with open arms and warm borscht. Well, that's the problem with being a dictator surrounded by yes men. Nobody is going to tell you the truth. The second problem with running such a regime is that your underlings are no doubt just as murderous and corrupt as you are. So it was of no surprise when rumors began to circulate that the Russian intelligence agents had not just borscht their job up, but had actually siphoned off large amounts of funds dedicated to their intelligence operations into private accounts. To be fair, Russia's operatives had succeeded in some ways. For instance, when the invasion reached Kherson, the bridges leading to the vitally important city were supposed to have been mined and prepped for demolition. Somebody, though, had ordered the mines and explosives removed, clearing the way for Russian invaders to cross the bridges. President Zelensky would respond by firing multiple senior political leaders from the region. Yet overwhelmingly, as Russian troops crossed the border into Ukraine, they were met with Molotovs and Kalashnikovs, not borscht and hugs as expected. But this wasn't the only strategic failure on Russia's behalf, even before the fighting started. As planning for the invasion began, Russia failed to account for the current state of Ukraine's armed forces. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, it did so with little opposition from Ukraine's armed forces. Overwhelmingly, the Ukrainian military melted away and retreated from the fighting. 8 years later, Russia believed that Ukraine's armed forces would repeat their performance of 2014, but failed to take into account that for the last 8 years, the United States had sent hundreds of trainers and senior military personnel to train Ukraine in order to restructure their armed forces. While the process was still ongoing and incomplete as the invasion started, the military that met the Russian invaders was a vastly different machine than what retreated en masse during the 2014 invasion. More mobile, more efficient, and trained in Western doctrine, Ukraine's military did not fall back as expected, but put up stiff resistance that soon slowed Russia's advances to a crawl. The failure to account for both Ukraine's willingness to fight and its military's new capabilities led to immediate disaster at the start of the war. Russia opened its gambit for Ukraine with a deep penetration air assault straight into the political heart of the nation, Kyiv. Its plan was simple, and given its 2014 successes and perceived overwhelming overmatch in firepower, should have worked. Fly Russia's most elite air assault forces to the outskirts of the capital, set up an air bridge, fly in reinforcements, and walk into Kyiv to execute Zelensky and replace him with a pro-Kremlin figure. The stubborn and uncooperative former Soviet republic soon once more would be back in the fold. Except that's not how things turned out. For starters, the air assault into Kyiv was terribly prepared and executed even worse. The linchpin of the entire operation was the Anatov airport, which was the primary target of Russia's air assault on Kyiv. Located just 10 miles from the heart of the capital, this airport had large enough runways to accommodate Russia's heavy-lift airplanes. A successful assault here would allow Russia to simply fly in heavy equipment and rapidly move into Kyiv itself. But Ukrainian resistance was not just stiffer than anticipated, but better equipped. As 2 to 3 dozen Russian helicopters approached the airport, they were met with manpad fire. Regular air defenses had been successfully neutralized, but Ukrainian defenders were armed with manpads provided by the West. Multiple helicopters were either destroyed or forced to land, disrupting the flow of the assault. Eventually, the defenders were overwhelmed, but Ukraine had been warned by the American CIA of an assault on the airport and was already mustering response forces. Without any heavy vehicles of their own, Russia's paratroopers were dependent on Russian aircraft for support. But these were met by Ukrainian fighters and were limited in their effectiveness. Ukrainian ground attack aircraft such as the Su-24s also pounded Russian positions. By the end of the first day of fighting, Russia's elite paratroopers had been defeated and forced to retreat into the forest outside the airport. There, they linked up with the Russian ground assault coming from Belarus and eventually wrestled control of the airport away from the Ukrainians. However, by then the airport had been so badly damaged, Russia couldn't use it anymore. Russia's failure to account for Ukrainian anti-tank weapons meant that the Belarus assault force was greatly delayed in linking up with the air assault. Left relying on spotty air cover, the lightly armed paratroopers were defeated and forced to retreat, while the heavy fighting and Ukrainian sabotage destroyed runways and made the airport impossible to use as an air bridge. This type of extremely shoddy strategic thinking quickly became a hallmark of the entire invasion. It very soon became apparent that Russia was either incompetent, was entirely too confident of its own abilities, or had severely underestimated Ukrainian will and capabilities. Truth is, all three of those things are true to a degree. Russian incompetence is evident in the entire invasion plan. As many Western observers noted, Russia made the completely unprecedented and confounding decision to launch a full-scale invasion without first conducting an air and missile campaign inside Ukraine. Modern military doctrine states that before using ground forces, one first uses strike aircraft and missile assaults to soften up a nation's defenses. This includes strikes against air defenses, command and control nodes, supply and logistics hubs, and radar installations. When the U.S. and coalition forces launched Desert Storm, air power was used to dismantle Iraq's ability to effectively control its own forces before a single tank crossed into Kuwait. Attacks against Iraqi air bases and radar sites also allowed coalition aircraft to rule the skies and denied Iraqi forces air support. Russia did none of this and instead launched its air campaign at the same time as its troops were crossing the border into Ukraine. What's more, it's become clear that its intelligence and recon capabilities were not up to par, as a significant number of its strikes failed to neutralize intended targets. This left Ukraine with a fully operational air force and air defense network that took a heavy toll on the Russians, while allowing Ukrainian aircraft to provide fire support for ground forces. Given that Russia operates the second largest air fleet in the world, it's absolutely baffling that the Russian aerospace forces, whose budget is larger than all of Ukraine's military budget combined, could not and still haven't won the war for Ukraine's skies. As the war continued, Russian basic military competency came into serious question. Everywhere you looked, it seemed as if Russia's military planners simply weren't up to the task, though this analysis might be skewed by the staggering amount of corruption within the Russian military. Things like bad tires leading to dozens of perfectly operational vehicles being abandoned can be blamed on corruption, with the unit commanders skimming the maintenance and acquisition budget and buying cheap Chinese tires for their vehicles instead of the military-grade tires they require. But the fact that abandoned vehicles showed clear signs of sun rot in their tires on only one side of the tire is evidence that Russian maintenance personnel are either poorly trained or its military is criminally inept. When kept in storage, vehicles must be rotated on a set schedule in order to avoid sun damage on only one side of the vehicle. It was clear that Russia had not done this, and the simple mistake cost them tens of millions in lost vehicles that Ukraine happily put to use. The US military has a saying: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Russia, it seems, has maintained its Soviet-era doctrine of under-equipping its units with logistics personnel and vehicles. Compared to an American unit, Russia assigns on average half as many logistics personnel and vehicles, meaning that its ability to project power far from its own borders is very limited. This was no clearer than in the suburbs of Kyiv, where the infamous 40-mile-long convoy of military vehicles would have its day in military infamy. Starved of fuel, ammo, and even food, Russian personnel either abandoned the vehicles or were forced to come to a dead standstill. The rapid advance on Kyiv, which was the linchpin of Russia's entire war strategy, failed because of its own doctrinal incompetence, and Ukraine took full advantage, ruthlessly attacking Russian supply lines. Rather than kill tanks, Ukrainian special forces went hunting for Russian trucks, to great effect. Each truck lost meant another 2 to 3 tons less food, ammo, and fuel, which meant an even slower and more vulnerable advance. Russia inevitably was forced to retreat from Kyiv and instead focused on its more successful operations in the east of Ukraine. Here it was steadily gaining ground, but the arrival of Western smart weapons such as US HIMARS rapidly changed the strategic picture for Russia. Failing to take into account the use of smart weapons, Russia suffered staggering losses of command personnel and supplies. This wasn't the only way that Russia failed to take into account how 21st century war was waged, as horrible electronic and signals intelligence discipline directly led to the assassination of dozens of senior military officers and the destruction of dozens of strategically important targets. Russian military personnel and reporters were freely streaming from near or adjacent to sensitive military sites, and its leaders were often using unsecured communication methods. All of this intelligence was very quickly scooped up by the West and directly fed to the frontline Ukrainian units armed with smart munitions, with predictable results for the Russians. In 6 months of fighting, Russia has lost more senior officers than the US lost in all of its conflicts since World War II, and it all comes down to a basic failure to understand 21st century warfare, as well as gross incompetence. Despite all this, however, Russia was winning the war for Ukraine, even if it was at an incredibly unsustainable win rate. However, in early September, Ukraine launched a massive counteroffensive that changed this and exposed yet another strategic failure from Russia. For well over a month, Ukraine had very loudly broadcast its plans to launch an invasion in the south with the goal of retaking Kherson. Russia took the bait and moved many of its best fighting forces from the north to the south. When the attack was launched, Ukrainian shaping operations using long-range precision HIMARS strikes led to some modest gains around the city. However, Russian forces were completely blindsided by a massive Ukrainian counteroffensive in the north, where its forces were weakest. While Ukraine had exercised strict operational security to keep the offensive a secret, even Russian military bloggers had made note of the buildup of Ukrainian forces in the north. Russian intelligence, however, completely missed the clues, and its forces were utterly overwhelmed, leading to a massive defeat and panicked withdrawal from the region. Russian apologists were quick to point out that the units in the north were some of Russia's least effective, and thus Ukraine's win is only temporary, as the moment that Russia's regular forces return to the area, Ukraine will be on the back foot once more. Yet this does not ring true at all, as a growing body of evidence shows that units such as Russia's vaunted 1st Guards Tank Army was present at Kharkiv and had not only been defeated but forced to flee in a panic, leaving behind many of its tanks for the Ukrainians. This is a clear indication that even Russia's best forces are having great difficulty inside Ukraine. The 1st Guards Tank Army was the very vanguard of Russia's ground forces. This was the force that was meant to smash into the teeth of NATO's best defenses in case of war and win. But what's perhaps even more telling for Russia's difficulties is the fact that even with Ukraine launching an offensive only miles from its own border, Russia's air force appeared to be mostly MIA from the fight. When you can't project air power literally miles from your own border, your military is in seriously bad shape. So, is Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine a failure? Well, after the Kharkiv offensive and the panicked retreat of its military, Russia has the dubious distinction of becoming Ukraine's #1 supplier of military vehicles. Directly supplying your enemy with more heavy vehicles than they had before you started fighting is not the best way to win a war. But Russia remains a massive military power, even if it seems incapable of using that power with any great amount of precision or aptitude. Reports from the Kharkiv offensive clearly showed that the Russian military is suffering from serious morale problems, and there's even reports of one artillery unit not undertaking a single fire mission during one day of fighting because the entire crew was drunk. This would seem incredible in a Western military, but it's frighteningly commonplace inside of the Russian military, where discipline is incredibly low even during peacetime. Such incidents were commonplace during both Chechen conflicts. Russia has not lost the battle for Ukraine, and the war is almost inevitably to drag on for another 6 months or longer. But strategically, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a definite failure, even if it were to magically win overnight for some reason. For its aggression, Russia has become a pariah state, and unprecedented Western sanctions, bordering on what it might face in case of a real war against the West, have left the Russian economy in a seriously perilous state. For the moment, the worst of the damage is being contained, thanks to a large war chest Putin had accumulated before the war. But that money will run out sooner rather than later, given that half of that money is in Western bank accounts that are now frozen. Sanctions will soon bite into the Russian economy even harder than they have been, and the ruble is seen as a Potemkin currency that's only being propped up by extreme measures that simply can't last. But the real problem for Russia is that many of its best and brightest professionals and artists have fled the nation in droves, weakening its ability to compete in a 21st century global economy. For its military, sanctions have been especially painful. Cut off from advanced Western technological components, Russia's military has nearly exhausted its supply of precision weapons. It's also having great difficulty manufacturing things such as air defense missiles, with one plant shut down and its workers told they could either go on unpaid leave or get paid to go and fight in Ukraine. When you're sending trained engineers to go fight and die in a trench, you're not doing your future self any favors. Even if Russia were to win in Ukraine, it would do so at a cost so steep that some in the West wonder if the nation isn't even now under the threat of breaking up. What would be left of Russia is a shadow of a power with a military that would take a decade or more to rebuild, and forced to rebuild with 20th century technology as it remains cut off from Western imports. Reduced to a shadow of itself, Russia's only real clout internationally would be its formidable nuclear arsenal. However, the clearest sign that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a massive strategic failure is that its very goal was to prevent the strengthening of the West against Russia. Yet the result is that Vladimir Putin is the only Russian leader who ever set out to weaken NATO and accidentally made it even stronger, thanks to Sweden and Finland's ascension into the alliance. At this point, Vladimir Putin has so thoroughly crippled his own nation that the American CIA should be naming buildings in his honor for his hard work in weakening the US's chief rival. A small contingent of Russian soldiers patrols the border. Their numbers are small, as many of their comrades have been sent south to fight a losing war against Ukraine. The soldiers are ordered to cross the border in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Hesitantly, they proceed, but as soon as they traverse the line between the two nations, they're met by M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 tanks. F-35 Lightning IIs scream through the air, and heavily armed NATO soldiers appear from seemingly nowhere. This hypothetical scenario is what's in store for Russian forces if they even think about attacking Finland. Russia had no hope of successfully invading Finland to begin with, and now the country is a part of NATO. The moment Russia shows any sign of aggression against Finland, 30 other countries will come to their aid, including the United States. This would be checkmate for Vladimir Putin. When Russia invaded Ukraine, 80% of the Finnish population wanted to join NATO. Previously, this was a country where the vast majority of people staunchly wanted to remain neutral. However, the very real threat of a Russian invasion is enough to change the mind of even the most staunch supporters of neutrality. The history between Russia and Finland has not been pleasant. And even though the Nordic nation has been improving its military over the years and is more than capable of defending itself, the population felt they needed to make a strong statement against their aggressive neighbor. So on May 17, 2022, Finland, along with Sweden, applied to be a part of NATO. Other Western powers applauded this move. It would allow NATO to be much more powerful and open up a whole new gateway to keep Russia in check. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, was furious. He threatened to launch missiles, invade, or take drastic actions to keep Finland from being accepted into the alliance. For a while, the world held its breath to see what Putin would do, since their application would be forfeit if he declared war against Finland before they were voted into NATO. The bylaws of the organization state that any nation which is already at war cannot be accepted. However, at this time, Putin had a much bigger problem developing in Ukraine. His forces were being decimated by Western weapons and the superior tactical skills of the Ukrainian military. Russia was taking heavy losses and being pushed further and further back toward its own borders. Putin didn't have the men or resources to launch an invasion of Finland, and even if he did, it's likely the Finnish military would crush anything Russia could throw at it. For almost a year, Finland's acceptance into NATO was hampered by two nations, Turkey and Hungary. In order for a new nation to be admitted into the organization, all previous members need to vote for their acceptance. These two nations were the only thing standing in the way of Finland joining the most powerful military organization in the world. Obviously, Vladimir Putin hoped they would never be admitted and that he could find a way to keep his northernmost neighbor from becoming even closer to the United States and its allies. The key thing to remember is that one of Putin's biggest reasons for invading Ukraine was to keep Western powers from encroaching further toward Russian borders. The Russian dictator claimed the war in Ukraine is carried out in self-defense as NATO nations and their forces threatened Russia's security. And to be fair, Putin wasn't wrong. However, even as NATO was becoming stronger, Finland had no plans to change its neutral stance. Unfortunately for Putin, his invasion of Ukraine drove the Finnish government right into the arms of NATO. He single-handedly caused a national shift in thinking, resulting in Finland dropping its neutral stance and searching for allies, something that up to that point no one else had been able to do. The irony is, Vladimir Putin caused his worst fears to become a reality. So let's explore why Putin is so afraid of Finland joining NATO and what it might mean for the future of the region. On Tuesday, April 4, 2023, Finland officially became the 31st nation to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Minister of Foreign Affairs Pekka Haavisto, along with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, were all part of the ceremony to officially welcome Finland to the organization. As the officials of those Western nations smiled and shook hands, Vladimir Putin frowned and brooded. When the Finnish flag was raised alongside the other 30 members of NATO, it stood as a declaration by the Western world that Putin's war in Ukraine and the objectives he hoped to achieve had failed. He could no longer intimidate nations to distance themselves from NATO. He could no longer threaten acts of war to get what he wanted. He could no longer put Finland in a position where it had to fear a repeat of past atrocities against its people. These are all major concerns for Vladimir Putin, but what he really is afraid of is that no one fears him anymore. In fact, Putin's decisions are starting to become a model for exactly what not to do if you rule a country and want to expand its borders. Putin claimed that the invasion of Ukraine was done for two main reasons. The first was that Ukraine itself belonged to Russia, and the people who lived there identified as Russian. This obviously isn't true, as the world recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign nation, and the fact that the Ukrainian citizens have been fighting to free their country from Russian forces for over a year proves that they don't want to be a part of Putin's delusion. The second reason why Putin claims he invaded Ukraine is what we mentioned before. The Russian dictators argued NATO is expanding too close to Russia and therefore posing a security risk to the nation. Therefore, to stop the encroachment of NATO, Russia had to invade Ukraine to protect itself. This is clearly the ravings of a lunatic, but to be fair, Ukraine was becoming increasingly westernized and looking to cultivate closer relationships with Europe and other Western nations. But regardless of what Ukraine's geopolitical stance was, Putin had no right to invade the country. This is what made Finland nervous in the first place. Vladimir Putin had continuously talked about forming a new Russian empire, and since Finland was once part of an old Russian empire, the Kremlin's actions were a real cause for concern. In the early stages of the war in Ukraine, when Russia looked like it might be able to secure Kyiv and annex at least part of its territory, Finland went on high alert. If Putin was successful in Ukraine, he would likely try to invade Finland too. So for now, we know that Putin is scared that Finland's NATO membership will bring the military alliance closer to Russian borders. One of Putin's main goals for invading Ukraine was to ensure that NATO access to Russian borders was restricted to the 754 miles or 1,213 kilometers between Norway, eastern Latvia, Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania. With Finland's admittance to the organization, its 830-mile or 1,335-kilometer border with Russia has more than doubled the border length that NATO countries now share with Russia. And this is the single largest blow to Putin, besides how much of a failure his invasion in Ukraine has been. And as we'll explain in a bit, the extension of NATO's border with Russia via Finland could cripple the nation, as some key strategic and economic hubs are now under direct threat. This, along with several other assets that Finland brings to the table, could spell the end to any type of Russian dominance in the region. NATO is no longer afraid of Putin, and now that Finland is officially part of the organization, it might be only a matter of time before Vladimir Putin loses complete control of his country. Before we examine each aspect of Finland's acceptance into NATO and how it's bad news for Russia, let's go back in time. Finland has never gotten along with Russia, which happens when a brutal foreign power takes over your country. How did Finland get to where it is today, and how has Russia left such a lasting scar on the nation that it was willing to give up its neutrality in exchange for extra protection? Well, like every part of the world, the history of Finland is long and complicated. In the 1100s, the Finnish people were subjugated during the Swedish Crusades and converted to Christianity. For the next 700 years, there were wars and different rulers in the region, but in 1808, Russia invaded Sweden with the support of Napoleon, and as a result, Finland was ceded to Russia, but surprisingly got to retain its own legal system and religion, while its citizens didn't have to serve in the Russian military. Then in 1899, relations between Russia and Finland started to go south. Tsar Nicholas II pursued policies to force the Russification of Finland. Basically, he wanted to wipe out the Finnish culture and force everyone to embrace the Russian way of life. This evidently didn't go over that well, and the Finns started to protest and fight back against the policies. In 1917, the Russian Revolution started to fracture the empire. Finland took this opportunity to declare their independence. However, they would only be free from the oppressive Russian rule for a few decades before the Red Army came knocking at their door once again. When World War II erupted in Europe, Finland declared that it would remain neutral. Even still, the Soviet Union took advantage of the chaos and invaded Finland in 1939, starting the Winter War. The Finnish army put up stiff resistance, however they were overwhelmed by the Red Army and were forced to sign the Treaty of Moscow, giving the Soviet Union control of about 10% of Finland's territory. With the help of the Nazis, Finland launched an offensive against the Soviet Union to reclaim its territory, but when Germany started to lose the war, Soviet forces came back with a vengeance and forced Finland to give up more land and pay war reparations. Once again, during the Cold War, Finland claimed it would remain neutral and no nuclear missiles or forces from either the Soviets or the US would be allowed within the borders. However, in the 1950s, Finland started to become closer to Western nations, even though the Soviet Union warned against such actions. By 1995, Finland became a member of the European Union, solidifying its connection to Western powers. The first steps toward Finland breaking away from neutrality began in 2016 when its government signed a defense collaboration agreement with the United States. This was a direct result of Russia increasing military activities in the Baltic Sea and annexing Crimea. It was at this time that Finland really started to become concerned with Vladimir Putin's actions and warned other Western powers of the very real threat that Russia posed. This brings us to the present day, where Russia has invaded Ukraine and Finland has joined NATO. It's been clear throughout history that Russia has either fully incorporated Finland into its borders or at least seen them as a country whose land they can steal. So it's no surprise that when Putin started to become even more aggressive in 2022, Finland decided to break its neutrality pact and join NATO. But why does Finland joining NATO change things, and why is it such a bad thing for Putin? Now that Finland is part of the organization, it means that if Putin or any other power tries to attack them, the entire might of the US and every other military in NATO will come to their aid. This is because of Article 5 in the NATO agreement. Finland no longer needs to worry about amassing enough troops or building enough weapons to combat Russia alone. Yes, Finland's military is still powerful and likely could hold its own against a Russian invasion, but now they don't need to dump tons of money into their military in fear that they might have to fight off an invasion force one day. Also, now that Finland is part of NATO, their forces will become fully integrated into the organization's training and planning programs. This will allow for better cooperation between Finnish soldiers and other NATO militaries. The superior training and cooperation only strengthens the Finnish military while allowing them to work in alignment with other military forces. But we must remember that Finland was already participating in NATO exercises as a partner state. It was actually a prerequisite for joining the organization that Finland needed to ensure their military could integrate current NATO technology and practices. So for years, Finland had been aligning its military to NATO standards. They purchased US FA-18 fighter jets, German-designed Leopard tanks, and K9 howitzers used by Norway and Estonia. Therefore, when Finland needed to join NATO for extra protection from Russia, they were good to go. The crazy part is that Putin watched this all happen. He must have known that Finland would jump the neutrality ship and join NATO if he became aggressive, and that's exactly what happened. There's the possibility that Putin thought everyone, including Finland, was too scared to risk upsetting him, but after major defeats in Ukraine and Russia's inability to effectively fight the war, it became apparent that Russia wasn't nearly as powerful as Putin portrayed it to be. However, before it became clear just how disjointed and ineffective the Russian military was, Finland applied to join NATO. This was almost an inevitability even if Russia hadn't invaded Ukraine, as Putin's expansionist rhetoric brought back cultural memories of Finland being subjugated by Russian regimes in the past. But when Finland officially announced it would drop its neutral policies in favor of NATO protection, it was very bad news for Putin. And Finland joining NATO isn't just a one-way street. The country has a lot to offer to the alliance. For example, it's generally agreed that Finland's artillery forces are not only the largest, but best equipped in all of Europe. This is out of necessity because of their large border with a belligerent neighbor. In fact, Finland has somewhere around 1,500 artillery weapons made up of 700 howitzer guns, 700 heavy mortars, and 100 rocket launcher systems. This means that the Finnish army has more artillery than Poland, Germany, Norway, and Sweden combined. This also means that the new stretch of Russian-NATO border is already well defended, which was definitely a plus when Finland was brought on board, as it meant other nations didn't need to immediately send artillery and defensive equipment to Finland. Plus, Finland's large artillery force could be incredibly beneficial in fortifying the borders of other countries in the future. Finland also brings strong cybersecurity tech to the table. The tech giant Nokia is based in Finland and is a major provider of 5G infrastructure worldwide. This means Finland is on the cutting edge of communication infrastructure and has the ability to improve NATO's cybersecurity. It's not clear exactly how Finland's advanced cybersecurity will be integrated into NATO practices, but one thing is for sure, in the future, cyber warfare will undoubtedly play a pivotal role in the way militaries wage battle. Then there's the obvious benefit of the soldiers that Finland provides to the NATO alliance. Since military service is mandatory in Finland, it means that the nation currently has 280,000 troops ready to go at this very moment. However, if Finland ever needed to mobilize its reserves, it would have around 900,000 trained men and women ready to take up arms in a conflict against a potential enemy. We mentioned before that there were two holdouts when it came to ratifying Finland into the NATO alliance. It's worth looking briefly at why this was the case and why Vladimir Putin was hoping that these issues would not be resolved quickly. It was clear to the Russian dictator that if Finland joined NATO, he would have an unstoppable enemy force at his doorstep. This is one of the reasons why Finland's acceptance into NATO terrified him. However, if Turkey and Hungary refused to vote Finland into NATO, Putin would have slightly less to worry about. When Finland and Sweden announced their applications to join NATO, a large majority of the nations in the organization immediately voted them in. This was because of the strategic significance both countries, but particularly Finland, held in the region. However, Turkey refused to ratify the two countries until some concessions were made. Turkey had more of a problem with Sweden, but Finland seemed to be guilty by association. A lot of the contention had to do with how the Kurdish people were being treated and the refusal of Nordic countries to sell Turkey weapons. The Turkish government said it would only vote to accept Sweden and Finland into the organization if they extradited several Kurdistan Workers' Party or PKK terrorist members back to Turkey and publicly disavow the PKK itself. Obviously, they also wanted both countries to remove their weapon bans as well. Both Sweden and Finland agreed to extradite the terrorists that they were holding. Finland also lifted its arms embargo on Turkey to improve the relations between the two nations. On March 30, 2023, Turkey approved Finland's petition to join NATO. Hungary's objection to the admittance of Finland was more just about politics than anything else. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán stated that both Sweden and Finland had been spreading slanderous lies about the state of Hungarian democracy. Basically, until they publicly apologized and met with Hungarian leaders, Hungary refused to vote for their acceptance into NATO. Orbán stated, "It's not right for Sweden and Finland to ask us to take them on board while they're spreading blatant lies about Hungary, about the rule of law in Hungary, about democracy, about life here." However, after diplomatic talks, Hungary agreed to move forward with their vote to accept Finland into NATO on March 27, 2023. After Hungary and Turkey voted for Finland to join the organization, Putin was in big trouble. All of his worst nightmares were coming true. It was now only a matter of time before Finland was officially a part of NATO, and there was nothing he could do about it. Even if he wanted to launch a last-ditch effort to stop the acceptance of Finland into the organization through warfare, he just didn't have the men or resources to do so, as most of Russia's military is still desperately trying to hold little territory it could control in Ukraine. The acceptance of Finland into NATO also set a precedent for other countries that might have tried to remain neutral. Putin's aggressive actions meant that foreign policy norms and international sanctions would not always work to deter an aggressor. Now that Finland has become a part of NATO, Putin likely fears other nations might also try to join the alliance. There's very little chance that even Putin would be crazy enough to invade a NATO country, as the repercussions would be devastating. Russia and all of its allies would not be able to defeat NATO forces unless they used nuclear weapons, which would pretty much end the world, and there's perhaps only one other dictator who's willing to go that far. We're talking about you, Kim Jong-un. So now Putin is afraid of NATO forces being close enough to attack major Russian cities from Finland, and that other nations might also seek an alliance with his biggest enemy. There's also the fact that there will be an even larger NATO presence in the Nordic region. As a result, Russian naval operations in the Baltic Sea might become riskier. Putin is concerned about what this could mean for important strategic military assets stationed on the Kola Peninsula, which sits along the northern border of Finland. It's here that Russia's Northern Fleet is stationed, along with ballistic submarines that are part of Russia's second strike nuclear capabilities. With increased NATO forces in the region, everything from Russian naval ships to aircraft operating in the area will be under closer surveillance, and could be more easily dealt with if a conflict ever did arise. Putin also knows that as his conventional forces continue to be depleted in Ukraine, Russia will have to rely more heavily on nuclear deterrence and its navy to protect its borders and maintain power. There's also the fact that Russia has been planning to use the Northern Sea route to boost economic trade and movement of goods. However, Finland's admittance into NATO now means that more naval ships from other countries, such as the US and Britain, could be stationed in the area and threaten Russian naval dominance in the far north. Hypothetically, having NATO naval bases and an increased regional presence could allow blockades to hit the Russian economy hard. In essence, NATO now has the ability to cut off St. Petersburg and other northern Russian ports from the rest of the world. Then, of course, Putin is scared about a future military buildup. Finland refused to allow foreign missiles on their soil for a long time. Now NATO can deploy operational tactical missile complexes across Finland, allowing them to strike key targets in Russia more accurately and at a moment's notice. Precision strikes could be launched from Finland to cripple Russian infrastructure and transportation networks, which has Vladimir Putin fuming. On top of that, more NATO aircraft will be stationed closer to Russian borders and could be launched into Russian airspace with incredible speed and devastating capabilities. The bottom line is, now that Finland is a part of NATO, the organization poses a much larger immediate threat to Putin's authority. The United States and its allies can police the region more effectively and keep Russia in check. Vladimir Putin hates anything that stifles his power, and Finland successfully joining NATO might be the biggest threat he's ever faced. This brings us to the question, what will Vladimir Putin do now? He's warned that the acceptance of Finland into NATO will force him to take retaliatory measures. It's unclear what this means, and if Russian forces are capable of doing anything besides losing the war in Ukraine. Putin has claimed that NATO deploying troops to Finland would only destabilize the region and threaten the stability of the world in a plea to try to gather support against NATO forces being stationed closer to Russian borders. But this has been wholly unsuccessful and likely would have worked better if Russia had never invaded its neighbor, but hindsight is always 20/20. Putin and the rest of the Russian leaders claim that Finland joining NATO was done to spread anti-Russian sentiment to more countries. However, NATO didn't really need any help doing that after the way Putin's been conducting himself over the past several years. The proclamations by the Kremlin to mobilize more troops and deploy more weapons along the Finnish-Russian border are a little more than empty threats, as Russia just doesn't have the military assets to spare at the moment. So instead, Putin's been using harsh words and posturing to try to seem strong during a time when he's becoming weaker and weaker, because if we're honest, losing power is what Vladimir Putin is most afraid of. And unfortunately for the Russian dictator, the bad news keeps on coming. On the same day that Finland was admitted into NATO, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was invited to join NATO's July summit in Lithuania. On top of that, European leaders arrived in Beijing to speak with President Xi Jinping about the war in Ukraine and trade relations. If these talks result in China either dialing back its support for Russia or lessening its economic and military aid, it could be the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. Even though China has continued to support Russia, it needs to maintain positive relations with Europe, as the EU is one of the biggest trade partners and much more important to the Chinese economy than Russia is. Therefore, these meetings might result in a powerful blow to one of Russia's only remaining lifelines. Vladimir Putin is in a rough spot. Finland joining NATO is just another consequence of his war in Ukraine and will likely result in an even weaker Russia in the future. And perhaps the biggest slap in the face for Putin was summed up by Secretary of State Antony Blinken when he said, "This is the one thing we can thank Mr. Putin for," referring to Finland joining NATO. Because he's right, Vladimir Putin was so sure he had the most powerful military in the world. He was sure his forces would easily overtake Ukraine and that his rule would be welcomed with open arms. He was sure that no one would stand up to him, and now he can't be sure of anything. When Finnish President Sauli Niinistö spoke during the induction ceremony, he stated, "The era of non-alignment in our history has come to an end. A new era begins." This new era will likely result in a weakened Russia and Vladimir Putin struggling to maintain his power. It's the deadliest ship on the seven seas, especially if you're serving aboard. Well, pretty much only if you're serving aboard it. It's the Admiral Kuznetsov, and it's the absolute worst ship to ever sail under the Russian flag. Admiral Flota Sovietskого Soyuza Kuznetsov, or in English, ship which barely works, was designed during the late Cold War. The Soviet Union had a historical disadvantage when it came to naval warfare, largely spurred on by its lack of access to warm water ports. This makes fielding a large maritime force difficult. But Russia's immediate proximity to large European powers also means that throughout its history, its army has been prioritized over all other services. Yet navies allow one to project power globally, and without one, it doesn't matter how big your army or air force is, you'll only ever be a regional power. Without a navy, you can't hold enemy economic interests at threat, unless they are a landlocked power, and resupplying your own troops becomes difficult. Protecting your own economic interests is also practically impossible, especially if you're heavily dependent on sea trade. This is the driving force behind China's massive naval buildup in the Pacific. The Soviet Union didn't completely axe its navy, but it knew that it couldn't compete with NATO, or mainly the US Navy. America has historically been the opposite of Russia, with two big oceans on either coast. The US has by necessity been a naval power. By the early 20th century, the US Navy was muscling in on the Royal Navy in terms of tonnage and capability. By the end of the Second World War, the US Navy reigned supreme, and would remain that way until China would rise to threaten it. And even then, China only presents a regional threat to the US Navy, not a global one. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union had two maritime goals in case of a war. First, to delay and disrupt US shipping to Europe, and the second, to defend its own shores and keep the US Navy from joining the fight. With a naval air force larger than most national air forces, the Soviet Union was in effect facing two American air forces. To achieve the first goal, the Soviets had to break the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, a stretch of ocean that runs between the three countries. Getting a surface action group past this defensive line was a dicey proposition at best, if not completely impossible outside of World War III historical fantasy books. However, the Soviets did have the capability of launching an amphibious assault against Iceland, linchpin of the Atlantic defensive line, albeit only if it could take NATO by surprise and move swiftly. Breaking the Atlantic line was vital for the Soviets keeping US firepower out of Europe. With a wall of NATO nations between it and the ports used to offload American troops and equipment in Europe, the Soviets could only hope to interdict American shipping across the Atlantic trade routes, much like the Germans attempted to do. Exactly like the Germans, the Soviets relied primarily on submarines to accomplish this task, and fielded a very large and capable submarine force for just a task. This left the Soviet surface fleet with the mission of defending Eastern Bloc shorelines from the US Navy, a role they would be far more survivable in. Operating close to shore in a fortress fleet doctrine, Soviet ships enjoyed the protection of shore-based air defenses and anti-ship missiles. However, the Soviets still wanted the capability to project power far from home in low-intensity conflicts, where they wouldn't have to face far more sophisticated naval forces. And there was the prestige of owning aircraft carriers, America's crown jewel. Thus, the Admiral Kuznetsov class was designed from the ground up for a fundamentally different role than that of the American carrier fleet. Until the Kuznetsov class, the Soviets never had true aircraft carriers, instead operating cruisers that could house small air wings. At first, this was only a small helicopter complement to aid in scouting and anti-submarine warfare. But in the 1970s, the Soviets laid down the Kiev class, a hybrid cruiser and fixed-wing aircraft carrier. Originally, the Soviet Admiralty wanted to develop a comparable supercarrier to the American Kitty Hawk class. However, budget realities soon set in, and the survivability of these massive platforms against the might of the US Navy was put into question. Thus, a compromise was reached, resulting in what the Soviets would call a heavy aviation cruiser. This fancy bit of wordplay, which should be familiar to Japanese audiences, was actually a pretty fair description, but also necessary so that the Soviet Kiev class could exit the Turkish Straits. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits, warships transiting the Turkish Straits between the Mediterranean and Black Sea were limited to a certain size, tonnage, and weaponry. Aircraft carriers over 15,000 tons were forbidden from crossing the straits, and this was a problem for the Soviet Union, as it built all of its aircraft-carrying cruisers in present-day Ukraine. While aircraft carriers over 15,000 tons were forbidden from crossing, aircraft-carrying warships were not, as at the signing of the treaty many battleships carried a small complement of aircraft for spotting fire and reconnaissance. Thus, the Soviets simply called their ships aircraft-carrying cruisers. And all was well, despite the complement of up to 12 Yak-38 VTOL aircraft. To be fair, the Kiev class was also packing significant firepower aside from its aircraft. Its foredeck was littered with air defense and surface attack missiles, as well as 10 torpedo tubes. The ships could pack P-500 anti-ship missiles, up to 8 in total, and sporting a fearsome 2,200-pound warhead, or alternatively a 350-kiloton nuclear warhead. Flying at Mach 3, these missiles haunted the dreams of U.S. sailors and were surprisingly sophisticated for the time. Fired in salvos, the missiles would fly at wave-top height, with one missile flying at higher elevation and using its radar to feed targeting data to the other missiles. If that missile was destroyed, another missile would automatically take its place. Upon reaching the final phase of their flight, all of the missiles would pop up and turn on their radars, with half the salvo homing in on big U.S. carriers and the rest on its escort ships. Only 3 of the Kiev class would be built, with one becoming a Chinese luxury hotel in 2014, another turned into a naval museum in 2016, and the third broken up and sold for scrap. A subclass of the ships known as the Baku subclass would result in one ship, the Admiral Gorshkov. This ship would be sold to India in 2004, refurbished, and continues to be in service with the Indian Navy as the INS Vikramaditya. And this is where we get at last the Admiral Kuznetsov class, and the ship which would be the flagship of the entire class, named, well, Admiral Kuznetsov. Planned to be a 2-ship fleet, only one was built thanks to the end of the Cold War and the Russian economy tanking. It might be smaller than a supercarrier, but it still packs a formidable punch and is well worth the title of aircraft-carrying heavy cruiser. Its primary armament is the Sukhoi Su-33, the carrier variant of the Su-27. Developed to replace the VTOL-capable Yak-38, the Su-33 featured an upgrade in range and payload, which forced the Soviet Union to ditch the VTOL concept entirely and build the larger Kuznetsov-class ships in the first place. It only carries a fraction of the aircraft of a U.S. carrier, but with 18 Su-33s on board, it's still a formidable weapon against lower-tier regional naval powers. However, the Kuznetsov isn't large enough to field an AWACS platform, which is where the 6-ship flight of MiG-29Ks come into play. Theoretically, the MiG-29s would have been able to network together with other aircraft and provide an airborne early warning and air control system, but that capability never truly materialized. Instead, the 6 MiG-29s were part of an incomplete order, which was meant to replace the entire Su-33 complement aboard the Kuznetsov. This leaves the Kuznetsov with a glaring vulnerability, as a surface action group without AWACS in the sky is just begging to be sent to the bottom of the sea. This is why aircraft carriers are so critical to modern blue water naval operations, and why, despite having more holes in the water, China remains unable to challenge the US far from its own shores. For a ship designed to fight close to home, though, this isn't a big vulnerability. But it does mean that the Kuznetsov is basically a liability in any conflict that doesn't take place under cover of shore-based air defenses or against a relatively unsophisticated foe. However, the Kuznetsov packs one hell of a punch with its 12 Granite anti-ship missiles. These supersonic missiles pack a 1,600-pound warhead that can sniff out American carriers at a range of 388 miles. The missiles are so physically large and move so fast that even a direct hit from a Sea Whiz system isn't guaranteed to stop the carnage, as the supersonic wreck of the missile slams into a ship's structure with deadly kinetic energy. Considering the U.S. fleet was and still is largely fielding anti-ship missiles with a third of the explosives, the Granite continues to give sailors headaches to this day. But the Kuznetsov was almost never a part of the Soviet fleet at all. The ship was laid down in 1982 at the Nikolaev South shipyard inside of Ukraine. When Ukraine and the Soviets went on the splits, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk sent a telegram to the ship's commander politely informing him that his aircraft carrier now belonged to an independent Ukraine. The captain was promptly ordered to sail to Vidyayevo before the Ukrainians could get their hands on it, ensuring it would have every opportunity to waste billions of Russian rubles in the years to come. In 1995, the Kuznetsov had its first deployment, and immediately the warning signs of what would be called Russia's cursed ship were on full display. From December 23, 1995 to March 22, 1996, the Kuznetsov and its escorts underwent a familiarization deployment into the Mediterranean, from whose warm waters the ship could operate nearly around the clock. The ship ran flight operations from early morning until 9 p.m. each day, flying aircraft close enough to the Israeli coast that the nation scrambled F-16s to escort the Russian fighters. Everything went well enough until the ship's evaporators began to break down. Responsible for creating drinking water for the crew by distilling seawater, the breakdown caused a severe water shortage amongst the crew. Sent for repairs, the ship would suffer the fate of much of the Russian Navy, as major financial problems caused severe cutbacks in the defense budget. The ship's fate was in effect as frozen as the Northern Fleet shipyard it lay moored in, with repairs being halted due to no funding being available. It wouldn't be until 1998 that the ship's overhaul was complete and she was cleared for service once more. However, aircraft carriers, or aircraft carrying heavy cruisers, aren't cheap to operate. The U.S. spends $1.5 million a day per aircraft carrier in operational costs. Thus, the Kuznetsov was stuck in port for a further 2 years, finally cleared for deployment in the Mediterranean in 2000. However, the sinking of the Kursk, a Russian-powered nuclear submarine, canceled any plans for deployment. Famously caused by a lack of maintenance and poor training, the sinking of the Kursk was an alarm bell for a long-neglected Russian fleet. In the wake of the tragedy, Russian admirals called for more funding, warning of future possible disasters. But budgets were tight, and the Russian Navy was a low priority. The Kuznetsov would assist in recovery of the Kursk before having future deployments once more canceled. As the world would come to see, this was probably a good thing, as soon serving aboard the Kuznetsov would be one of the deadliest jobs in the Russian Navy. In 2004, the carriers went out to sea for sea trials and inspection, showing worrying signs of poor maintenance. Nonetheless, she was cleared for operation, and in 2004 she partook in a large exercise in the Atlantic. In 2005, she would claim her first victim and highlight a crippling deficiency that would claim aircraft for over a decade to come. In 2005, the Kuznetsov was undergoing training in the North Atlantic when a Su-33 piloted by Sub-Colonel Yuri Korneev came in for a landing. According to the Russian government, the plane's brakes failed, causing it to skid along the runway and crash into the ocean. Luckily, the pilot was able to eject and was safely recovered, with the Russian government later dropping depth charges on the wreckage of the plane 3,000 meters below and then sending a submersible to ensure the plane was properly destroyed. However, soon sources came forward to counter the official government story. According to these sources, as the Su-33 came in for a landing, the arresting cable responsible for safely slowing the plane down broke. The Su-33 was thus sent sliding across the deck and over the edge. For a Russian government so focused on public perception, it would be easier to blame the airplane rather than one of the most fundamental systems of an aircraft carrier. However, whatever the truth is, further training flights were canceled as the Kuznetsov once more sailed for home. In 2006, the Kuznetsov was slated to return to service after modernization efforts to correct fundamental issues with the ship's systems. But it wouldn't be until December 2007 that the Kuznetsov was once more sent on deployment. Here, the Kuznetsov would enter a sort of grace period, where everything largely worked as it should. However, a lack of proper maintenance by a cash-strapped Russia, determined to prove it was a legitimate naval power, would lead to disaster. In 2009, a short in a wire caused a fire which would kill one crew member. Later that year, the ship caused an international incident. On February 14, 2009, a European Maritime Safety Agency's Clean Sea Net satellite alerted to a detected oil spill just off the southern coast of Ireland. An Irish Air Corps patrol aircraft was dispatched, visually confirming the spill surrounding the Admiral Kuznetsov and its underway replenishment ships. Coincidentally, the Kuznetsov was undergoing refueling at the time, but the Russians immediately denied that anything had happened. The British, meanwhile, estimated about 300 tons of oil had been spilled. The Russians admitted culpability, though claimed only 20 to 30 tons of oil had been spilled, while either washing the ship's decks or pumping out the bilges. Consider those numbers. The Russians were apparently greasing their entire flight deck with oil an inch thick, to cause a massive spill. Of course, it wasn't 20 to 30 tons, but rather 300 tons over an area 4 miles by 5 miles. 2 days later, the Russians confirmed they'd been undergoing refueling when the spill happened, but did not know how or why it had occurred. Given that the Kuznetsov was at this point being escorted by one tugboat in case it broke down, the cause of the spill was pretty obvious. 10 days later, the Russians would admit fault and claimed that human error and technical malfunction had been to blame, with what technical malfunction that was exactly remaining a mystery. In 2011, the Kuznetsov was sent to menace the world's oceans once more, in a deployment lasting until February, when it departed Syria for its home port, and promptly lost all propulsion. Despite a year of repairs after the oil spill incident, the Russian fleet had such little faith in the Kuznetsov that it once more had been deployed with an accompanying tugboat. That proved prudent, as the Nikolai Chiker would take the mighty Russians' fleet flagship in tow and slowly drag it back home. She would have one more successful deployment under her own power until she was once more deployed in 2016 off the coast of Syria to support Russian military operations, bombing civilians because military targets are too hard to accurately hit. Once more, she was accompanied by an ocean-going tug, which probably really filled her small surface action group with great confidence in the Russian flagship's ability to survive combat. The ship Su-33 had been fitted with bomb sights to allow the use of free-fall bombs with limited accuracy, allowing the carrier's planes to carry out ground attack missions inside Syria. By now, the Kuznetsov was famously belching out huge clouds of black smoke as she steamed along, and on October 21st she passed through the English Channel. The British Royal Navy dispatched 2 ships to escort the largest Russian naval deployment since the Cold War. On November 14, 2016, a MiG-29 took off from the carrier on a routine exercise, only to be put into a holding pattern when the crew realized that one of the arresting cables had once more broken. Rather than be diverted to a nearby airbase, the ship's captain ordered the pilot to stay in the air. Inevitably, the MiG-29 ran out of fuel and was forced to ditch into the sea, with the pilot being rescued via helicopter. The incident highlighted not just the gross incompetence of the ship's captain, which cost the Russian Navy an $11 million jet, but also the disrepair of the ship itself, as well as its greatest design flaw. Because the ship had basically been designed to be a carrier light, it utilized a ski ramp to aid planes in taking off. However, ski ramps severely limit the fuel and ordnance of a carrier aircraft, as well as the type of aircraft the ship can deploy. On a full-sized carrier or one with more powerful launch facilities or even planes with more powerful engines, the MiG-29 would have likely had enough fuel that when it became obvious the arresting cable wasn't being fixed, it could have still made for a friendly airfield. But that's just not the Russian way. And despite the arresting cable historically snapping in two, the captain ordered the plane to stay in the air until it ran out of fuel. The Kuznetsov continued combat operations, with the Russians claiming major victories in airstrikes against Islamic State terror groups. Given that the ship was already suffering from a severe shortage of qualified pilots and the imprecision of Russian precision weapons, these claims remain dubious. However, on the 3rd of December, half a month after its first arresting gear failure, the Kuznetsov struck again, destroying another Su-33 as its arresting gear failed once more. The Su-33 slid straight into the drink and the pilot was forced to eject. At this point, the Kuznetsov had downed more Russian aviators and inflicted a greater financial cost to Russia than the Islamic State had, and it was decided that the rest of the air power on the ship would be transferred to airfields to continue combat operations, to what we can only imagine was the great relief of the entire crew. Field repairs were carried out until Russia ceased the involvement of the Kuznetsov's battle group in the region and dispatched it for home. Now safely in port at the 35th Ship Repair Plant in Murmansk, the Kuznetsov would lose its appetite for Russian planes and develop a new one for Russian lives. In what could only be described as a comedy of errors, the Kuznetsov took on the job of single-handedly destroying as much of the Russian defense budget as it possibly could. The ship needed serious repairs, but whether it was the vodka or completely unfounded Russian optimism, the Kuznetsov began a modernization program to extend its service life by 25 years. Huge combat ships are expected to have service lives that extend into the decades. After all, U.S. carriers can serve for half a century without major maintenance. But U.S. carriers also, generally, just work. The Kuznetsov did not only not work, it was fundamentally flawed with an aircraft arresting system that saw systemic breakdowns and also had no role in the modern cash-strapped Russian military. The Kuznetsov was a bad ship with no mission, but it was a prestige item for Vladimir Putin's Russia. So in typical Russian fashion, Russia doubled down on an absolutely terrible investment. because sunk cost fallacy is apparently not taught there. The Kuznetsov needed serious upgrades to its superstructure, electronic components, arresting gear, crew facilities, engines, everything. The ship was moved to the PD-50 floating dock, one of the largest floating docks in the world. This was very much a case of Freddy meets Jason, as PD-50 had its own colorful history. It was built in 1978 for the Soviet Union by Sweden, and at the time would be the world's largest floating dock. However, during sea trials, 2 of its ballast water tanks collapsed and threatened to sink the dock, prompting the Swedes to quickly tow it back to shore. Repairs were made and PD-50 was handed over to the Soviets. The Soviets took PD-50 in tow using 2 Dutch tugboats. However, after sailing past the Norwegian coast, PD-50 attempted to defect to NATO and made a break for freedom, breaking free of its tugs. Unfortunately, its quest for sweet capitalist freedom was ended when storm winds blew the dock ashore on the Soviet side of the Norwegian border. Damage to the dock was extensive but ultimately deemed repairable. Thus, the dock was shipped to a Norwegian shipyard where 4,000 tons of steel were used in its reconstruction. The accident-prone PD-50 would cross paths with Kuznetsov in 2018 when it had enough of living under Russian yoke and decided to permanently quit the chat, and it would try to take the Kuznetsov with it. PD-50 suddenly began to sink, causing the Kuznetsov to sink with it, and one of the dock's 70-ton cranes to come smashing down onto the Kuznetsov's flight deck. The accident left a massive 200-square-foot hole that would cost 70 million rubles to fix. The crane itself would take until the end of 2018 to be removed, slowing down repair efforts even further. The Kuznetsov was at least floating, though, and repairs continued on board the ship. In late May 2019, it was decided that 2 dry docks would be merged to make room for the Kuznetsov and other large surface vessels of the Russian Navy, though this would take 1.5 years of construction efforts. Out of dry dock, most of the necessary repairs and upgrades to the Kuznetsov could not be carried out, pushing its expected completion date back years. To make matters worse, the ship caught fire in December of 2019, killing 2 and injuring over a dozen. Damage to the ship was estimated at $8 million. In May 2022, though, the finish line was in sight and the ship was being prepared for removal from dry dock. That's when the world's most flammable ship went up in flames again, with Russian state news agencies claiming the fire was promptly put out and the ship's damage control system had done its job with no damage. The Kuznetsov would make its triumphant and murderous exit out of dry dock in February 2023. However, the ship is estimated to still need about 1 year of overhauls before it is combat-worthy once more. And combat-worthy is a term we're using about as loosely here as the Russian Navy. It'd be more accurate to say that it'll be about 1 year before the Kuznetsov is ready to return to the task of generally doing more to hurt the enemy than its own crew and the Russian budget. Generally, but not completely. Putin's troubles are mounting at breakneck speed. That's the message from former CIA Chief of Russian Operations Steve Hall. And what comes next might break the Russian dictator. Today, we'll explore Steve Hall's predictions for what will happen in Ukraine and see if Putin is truly doomed. It's almost impossible to turn on the news nowadays and not hear more reports about Ukraine asking for additional ammunition. Recently, a sensationalist story about Ukraine running out of air defense missiles had many believing that the end was nigh, and the Russian Air Force would finally show up and rain destruction from the skies, ending all Ukrainian resistance. However, the truth was that Ukraine was simply stating that at the current rate of consumption, they would be running out of missiles in a matter of months, not immediately. Likewise, Ukraine has famously been running into supply shortages of shells for its artillery as well as other more specialized kit like GMLRS rockets for its HIMARS. But what might surprise you is that Russia is having the exact same problems, if not worse. Russia's ammunition problems are becoming just as acute as Ukraine's, but unlike Ukraine, Russia doesn't have the advantage of a global coalition of allies and partners willing to shoulder the burden of resupplying it. Russia's global coalition instead consists of Iran, reportedly South Africa, and China on the down low. The advantage that Russia has had over Ukraine, however, was a massive stockpile from the Cold War when everyone was hoarding ammo in anticipation of Armageddon. But that stockpile is running dangerously low. A few months ago, Ukraine announced that for the first time since the start of the war, it had achieved artillery parity with Russia on occasion. Typically, Russia fired 20 times the shells Ukraine fired back. But ammo shortages brought the two to a more even playing field. HIMARS strikes and Special Forces sabotage behind enemy lines helped exacerbate Russia's ammo problems bringing the average exchange rate to 6-1. This dramatic drop in artillery had a direct effect on Russia's ability to conduct offensive operations because Russia has a garbage army that relies on blasting everything in front of it to oblivion from far away before moving their garbage army forward to take ground. Unsurprisingly, when Russia is no longer able to deliver overwhelming amounts of artillery at long range and its ground forces have to actually fight, the results aren't very pretty. But that's to be expected of an army that undergoes very little real training and is mostly made up of conscripts, with the few professional soldiers it does have more interested in corruption and lining their own pockets than actually soldiering. Russia's largest gains in the time after Ukraine's fall offensive were at the hands of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin's private army that Putin contracted out to fight in Ukraine. Unlike the rest of the Russian military, Wagner is better equipped and better trained, but their best war-winning strategy was the use of prisoners recruited from Russian detention centers who were promised their freedom if they survived a term of fighting in Ukraine. Neither Prigozhin nor Putin had any intention of allowing the majority of these prisoners back into society after being incarcerated, and thus Prigozhin used them in human wave attacks that were very successful in Bakhmut. Under threat of being shot if they retreated, Wagner unleashed hundreds of armed prisoners to assault blindly into Ukrainian positions. Once the Ukrainians opened up and thus revealed their defenses, Wagner's regular non-prisoner forces would mount direct assaults. The tactic was brilliantly effective if, like most Russians, you have little to no regard for human life other than your own. Ukraine was steadily pushed back under the sheer weight of the manpower the Russians were willing to sacrifice, only to then use well-trained and equipped forces to assault where the weak points emerged or were discovered. It's not entirely unlike Russia's strategy during the great sieges of cities during World War II. Wagner's successes were not just fueled by the sacrifice of prisoners, though, as it was heavily reliant on the Russian Ministry of Defense for supplies and equipment. While Wagner has over the years purchased a significant amount of its own equipment, including attack helicopters and artillery, inside of Ukraine the group has been extremely reliant on the Russian military for resupply. And this has been Prigozhin's Achilles heel, and might end up costing Russia the battle for Bakhmut after 10 months of fighting. And it all comes down to the way Russia does politics. Well, Putin specifically. Like any good dictator, Putin ensures that none of his underlings are too successful, as that might draw people under their banner. If that were to happen, then that underling might gain enough political capital and popular support to usurp Putin's throne. Or, this being Russia, just straight up murder him. Thus, Putin ensures that his government is constantly at odds with itself, with advisors and those who hold senior positions in his government and military all actively working against each other. This is where Prigozhin enters the chat, because the man once known as Putin's chef has seen a meteoric rise to become one of Putin's bestest and goodest of good boys. Despite private military companies being against the law in Russia, Putin has allowed Prigozhin to fund the establishment of Wagner under one condition. It would, in all but name, serve as an extension of Putin's, not Russia's, power. Thus, Wagner Group intervened all over Africa and the Middle East, greatly expanding Russian influence and enriching Russian businesses while committing a laundry list of atrocities and human rights abuses that would rival the Russian military's own. Wagner's successes quickly shot Prigozhin up the ranks of Putin's personal goodest and bestest boys, until eventually Prigozhin was one of the very goodest and very bestest of all his boys. And that didn't sit well with Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, because a man with Prigozhin's ambitions and military successes who also owned his own private army wouldn't be content being Minister of Agriculture or silly walks. Prigozhin was gunning for Shoigu's job, and Shoigu was doing a bad job of showing why he should get to keep it. Under his leadership, the Russian military had become the #1 supplier of military aid to Ukraine as it broke and ran time and time again. And we're not kidding about this. While the West has pledged around 100 tanks, Russia has abandoned an estimated 500 to be captured by Ukraine. That's on top of sophisticated air defense systems, vast amounts of ammunition, and a whole lot of very expired rations. To say that this was a real bad look for Shoigu is an understatement, and many have wondered why Putin has fired multiple Russian generals, but never his top goodest military boy. The truth may be that Putin keeps Shoigu in charge of the military because without Putin, Shoigu is nothing. Like Prigozhin, Shoigu is a complete outsider to Russian power politics, having ascended the ranks and coming from a nothing background. This means Shoigu has very few allies in the halls of Russian power, and thus cannot be a threat to Putin. But Shoigu is most certainly feeling the heat, as Prigozhin put the Russian military on blast over and over again over its failures, even while touting the victories of the Wagner Group. It would be easy to replace one man that Kremlin elitists don't particularly care for with a completely different one, and still remain secure knowing whoever's running his military would never have the political capital to challenge him. Eventually, Shoigu struck back. First, he took credit for Soledar, a salt mining town in eastern Ukraine that by all accounts Wagner did most of the fighting for. An angered Prigozhin took to social media to refute the Ministry of Defense claims that it had been the Russian army who took the town. But Shoigu wasn't done, and just as Wagner was on the eve of its greatest success in Bakhmut, with only 2 kilometers left to take the entirety of the town, Shoigu pulled the plug of supplies. Now Russia has been having legitimate supply issues, which Ukraine has tried to alleviate by donating multiple volleys of HIMARS rockets directly to Russian supply depots. But by all accounts, Shoigu has purposefully manipulated supply chains to keep Wagner on a very tight leash in Bakhmut, and then at the start of May yanked the leash hard enough to keep Wagner from succeeding. Prigozhin responded by taking to social media to rant like a 14-year-old who just lost a ranked Call of Duty match. He threatened to pull Wagner forces out of Bakhmut altogether and hand them over to the Russian military, which would have been a massive disaster and thrown the door wide open for Ukraine to launch a devastating counterattack. Shoigu and the Ministry of Defense claimed that they were not manipulating supplies on purpose and that Wagner was receiving everything it was allotted. Then, Prigozhin upped the stakes by declaring his forces would pull out of Bakhmut on May 10th. Suddenly, the supplies started flowing again and Prigozhin recanted. However, just 2 days later, Prigozhin was once more complaining his forces were being denied supplies. So, was Shoigu really preventing Wagner from winning in Bakhmut? Or are Russia's supply problems that severe? First, Russia's supply problems are definitely that severe. Russian guns, which used to fire nearly around the clock, are now silent for long stretches of time. Ukrainian frontline forces have had significantly more breathing room, as evidenced by recent assaults across the Dnipro River in the Kherson region and elsewhere. Operations that would have been met with immediate disaster due to overwhelming Russian firepower. But Shoigu is without a doubt making a play in Bakhmut to cut Prigozhin's knees out from under him, or at least he tried to. Wagner has been responsible for the main assault on Bakhmut itself, while its flanks were secured by the Russian army. The Russian army on the city's flanks have been attempting to cut off Bakhmut for months now with the goal of reaching the 2 major supply routes going in and out of Ukrainian positions. As Wagner drew closer to its complete capture of the city and Ukrainian forces were pushed further to the outskirts, the flank attacks increased in tempo, with up to 53 attacks in one day reported across one stretch of highway. The fighting raged even as Wagner ran out of ammo, making it clear that Shoigu was hoping the Russian army could close the encirclement and claim victory while Wagner was forced to sit on its hands for a lack of ammunition. But Ukraine got a say in all of this and it chose violence. While the initial flank attacks were successful, Ukraine's emergency deployment of special forces held in reserve for the spring offensive stopped the Russian army's offensive and then started to push them back. With Wagner unable to launch attacks against Ukraine's center, it freed up manpower to reinforce the flanks and began to assault in a counterattack that continues to this day. In fact, Prigozhin has recently taken to social media once more to berate the Russian forces, which have been slowly but steadily ceding ground to Ukrainian attacks and potentially leaving Wagner's flanks completely exposed. Prigozhin's latest attacks against the Russian military have bordered on outright sedition. He's claimed that the Russian army forces have broken and ran at first contact with the Ukrainians, and states that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is in full swing. However, Ukrainian soldiers on the ground confirmed to CNN in an interview that the forces which were cutting and running were actually Wagner troops, while Russian regular army units were holding their ground until they were defeated. And as far as the coming counterattack, there's no sign yet that Ukraine has launched its full offensive, with actions around Bakhmut being part of the regular ebb and flow of the ongoing 10-month battle. Prigozhin didn't stop there though, as in an incredibly rare event he seemed to lash out directly at Putin. In one of his broadcasts, Prigozhin appeared to vent frustration aimed squarely at Putin. As his troops once more ran out of ammunition and the Bakhmut flanks came under attack, Prigozhin stated, "And the happy grandfather thinks that he is good. If he turns out to be right, then may God grant everyone health. But what will the country do, our children, grandchildren who are the future of Russia? And how can we win this war if, by chance, and I'm just speculating here, it turns out that this grandfather is a complete shithead?" Putin is frequently referred to as the grandfather by the Russian military and political leadership, and Prigozhin's statement seems to be taking aim directly at Putin in what would be the most public and radical critique of Putin by any senior official. Prigozhin was quick to walk the comment back when interviewed by the press, giving multiple figures in the Russian Ministry of Defense whom he states could be the grandfather he was referring to, while never mentioning Putin. However, in all likelihood, this is a sign of even Prigozhin's growing frustrations, which he is in turn now venting directly into the Russian military leadership. And this is one of Putin's biggest headaches, though it is doubtful if he ever sees it as such. With Shoigu and Prigozhin actively sabotaging each other, the Russian offensive in Bakhmut is coming apart at the seams right when it's at the cusp of complete victory. A victory which, we'll have to remind you, is completely worthless, as Bakhmut is utterly strategically unimportant, save as an ideological win for Russia. The Bakhmut trauma is playing out all over the war effort though, as different factions within the Russian army all vie to undermine each other and secure their own glory and political wins. This chaos is by Putin's own design though, as he works to ensure that no one faction from Chechnya to Wagner to the Russian military becomes powerful enough to challenge him directly. Even as Russians die by the droves because of it, Putin's own future is assured. Now Putin's troubles have increased once more, and it's for once not because of its own forces. Ukraine has been begging for long-range precision weapons since the war began, but the West has steadfastly refused. It took months to get HIMARS to Ukraine, given the ability to target several dozen miles behind the front lines. But Russia responded by simply moving its command posts and supply depots further back and out of range. This had an immediate impact on its ability to operate, but did not completely disrupt its efforts the way long-range precision weapons would. Since then, the US has categorically declined to supply Ukraine with ATACMS, which would triple the range of the HIMARS Gimler's rockets and could threaten Russian targets all the way to Crimea. The US might be right in its denial, as ATACMS might be very high in demand in case of war in the Pacific against China. But after over a year of waiting, the UK has once more taken the lead and provided Ukraine with the Storm Shadow cruise missile. Originally developed in the 90s, the Storm Shadow missile has a degree of stealth much like the US's long-range anti-ship missile. This makes it a significant problem for Russian air defenses, and with a range of over double the HIMARS, Ukraine will finally have the tool it needs to strike at sensitive Russian targets deep behind the front. The Storm Shadow missile can be fired from either the ground or from the air, where it'll achieve its maximum range. It's not known if the missile is compatible with Ukraine's Soviet planes, but the UK expressed confidence that Ukraine would be able to make the quote full use of the missile. It's also unknown just how many of the missiles the UK has donated, though the UK Defense Minister Ben Wallace assured that at least some Storm Shadows are already inside Ukraine, with more on the way. With over 900 of the missiles in its inventory, the UK has plenty to spare, especially as it's now seeking to modernize the Storm Shadow and field a new, more capable variant. This means that there is a pressing need to get rid of the existing stockpile, so Ukraine might find itself with hundreds of Storm Shadow missiles if UK rearmament efforts produce a more capable evolution and begins to mass produce it. Ukraine has promised not to strike inside the Russian Federation itself, because while Russia is allowed to strike Ukrainian targets with impunity, nobody in the West wants to risk giving Putin a frowny face. Once more, Putin's crazy rants about nuclear weapons are paying dividends, as the West collectively browns its pants in anticipation of the imaginary nuclear Armageddon Putin might unleash if military bases in Russia start blowing up. In response, Ukraine has been establishing its own long-range cruise missile program, literally from backyard workshops across the country. The fact of the matter is that Ukraine can't hope to win this war without striking at the Russian bases supplying the war effort. And until it does, even if it beats Russian forces all the way back to its borders, Russia will simply launch long-range attacks into Ukraine while massing for a fresh assault. But Putin's final headache is coming from within. On May 3rd, 2 drones were apparently used to launch an attack on the Kremlin. One was intercepted, with Russia claiming it also intercepted the second, which instead simply appeared to detonate an explosive charge next to the Kremlin's flagpole. Russia immediately blamed Ukraine, which categorically denied the attack. According to Russian sources, the drone attack was an attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin directly, which, if true, would mean that Ukraine came a lot closer to decapitating Russia's leadership than the dozens of Spetsnaz Russia deployed at the start of the war to kill Zelensky. However, the drone's tiny explosive charge would have been unlikely to kill Putin unless he coincidentally chose that night to climb to the roof of the Kremlin to recreate his favorite scene from King Kong. The blame then shifted to the US, which Russia claimed had given the order for Ukraine to attack the Kremlin with drones. However, as one commentator noted, if the US had been behind the attack, the Kremlin would be a crater. Also, it simply doesn't even make sense, as the US had been reluctant to provide any long-range weapons to Ukraine exactly because of its fear that Ukraine would use them to launch attacks into Russia. Putin's nuclear saber-rattling worked. Everyone in the West has the Hershey squirts at the thought of the quote escalation. It's utterly unthinkable then that the US would simply give the green light for Ukraine to assassinate a flagpole. Instead, many now believe that the drone attack represents an internal threat, and a real one this time. Putin is most likely the master of false flag attacks, although in truth he's simply borrowing his favorite tactic from the Russian playbook because Russians have no problem killing other Russians to advance political goals. A false flag attack on their own border guards preempted the invasion of Finland in World War II, and Putin coordinated a series of false flag terrorist attacks to legitimize himself as president and launch a hilariously disastrous invasion of Chechnya, where Russian tank forces got their teeth kicked in by a bunch of rebels with exactly 0 tanks. But the attack on the Kremlin just might be the real deal, and the call may be coming from inside the house. Since the war began, Russian military recruiting officers have had a bad habit of spontaneously catching fire. As the war dragged on, it was now warehouses, shopping malls, railroad tracks, and even fuel facilities that were now going up in flames or exploding. Without a doubt, a number of these have been the work of Ukrainian sabotage operatives, as they followed almost to the letter old Soviet sabotage doctrine that would have been put into effect in case of a war against NATO. Russia has apparently forgotten that Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union, and while it forgot its Cold War training, Ukraine apparently did not. However, a growing Russian resistance movement has been gaining steam even as hundreds of thousands of men are drafted and sent to war. On January 3rd and 4th, partisan attacks on railroads halted the movement of men and supplies along the Trans-Siberian Rail Network, all going to Ukraine. This would be the 6th case in just the first few days of the new year of partisan activity. In the prior year, multiple locomotives were destroyed and there were 40 confirmed cases of sabotage of Russian rail infrastructure. The fact that this activity increased significantly after the announcement of Putin's partial mobilization implies heavily that this is a true Russian partisan movement and not more Ukrainian sabotage. Currently, the resistance movement is tiny, but the number of attacks seem to be increasing over time. This could turn into a massive headache for Putin, especially as many now state that Russia cannot win in Ukraine without a full mobilization. But Putin has likely taken the temperature inside of Russia itself and knows that a general mobilization could be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. Russians love themselves a good old dictator, but Putin broke the social contract upheld in Russia for decades. You can be the dictator all you want to be, as long as you don't actively make life worse for Russian citizens. If you listen to Putin, the war in Ukraine is going swimmingly, but some ominous signs point to a very different reality. What was boasted of as a few weeks' war that would see Russia overrunning Kyiv has instead turned into a year-long quagmire that still has Russia fighting over the slice of Ukraine that they took in the early days, using countless soldiers and fast-dwindling equipment to battle Ukrainian defenders over sparsely populated, bombed-out cities like Bakhmut. But despite this, Putin has not taken his foot off the gas. In fact, he's gotten more belligerent than ever, frequently threatening NATO with direct retaliation. But for those reading the tea leaves, all the evidence is pointing to the fact that the Russian war effort may be reaching a disastrous turning point. The first indication that the war is going bad for Putin might be that he's increasingly belligerent again. He's stepped up his threats against the West, claiming that every new step by NATO is risking nuclear war. But in terms of who's actually risking nuclear war, it's only him. In recent days, Putin announced the suspension of the last major nuclear weapons treaty between the US and Russia. New START, which took effect in 2011, only had 3 years left before it had to be renewed, but now Putin is pulling out effective immediately. This treaty allowed each country to obtain information on the other country's nuclear arsenal through inspection, and was part of a larger effort post-Cold War to prevent the uncontrolled growth of nuclear weapons. So what does this mean in practice? Experts say it's not the sign of strength Putin wants it to be. For one thing, Putin is now free to update his nuclear arsenal without any oversight. Russia has the world's largest nuclear arsenal, but that might be deceiving. Much like the US, Russia developed its nuclear arsenal during the Cold War, when the primary goal was to ensure mutually assured destruction between the two superpowers. If either one fired off a nuclear weapon, odds were that all life on Earth was going to die. That thankfully never happened, and the weapons just sat in storage for decades, waiting and biding their time. But that time might never come. Putin likes to threaten a nuclear first strike at every opportunity, but it's not clear if he could even pull it off. Nuclear weapons need to be inspected and maintained every few years to stay in working order. Not only have the Russian weapons been in storage for decades, but many of them were stored in regions of the Soviet Union that are now independent countries, including Russia. It's not clear how many Russian weapons are even still in working order, or how many experts there are in maintaining Soviet-era weapons. The US, which is vastly wealthier than Russia, has publicly admitted trouble in keeping its own massive stockpile properly maintained and recently allocated billions into a modernization program. So it's doubtful Russia has managed to keep its own even bigger arsenal in good working order. Now, Putin has a reason to want new and modern weapons. It's possible that his withdrawal from the New START treaty might just be a game of brinksmanship and intimidation, but it's also possible that Putin is planning to ramp up production on a modern wave of nukes. However, there are some mixed signals on that front. Only a few days after withdrawing from the treaty, Putin clarified that it was only a partial withdrawal and would not lead to the design of new weapons. This means that the only point of the move was to make Westerners even more scared about the possibility of nuclear war, a fear that Putin uses to manipulate the West into self-deterrence. Of course, like many things about the war, what Putin says and what he does might be very different. If Putin had the chance to add new and more powerful nuclear weapons that didn't date back 40 years to his arsenal, the odds are he would jump at the chance, but he's not, which indicates it might be yet another area where Russia is being frozen out. It's well known that Russia is more isolated than ever before, with most of the world sanctioning Russia and cutting it off from the global economy. Its only consistent allies are its satellite state Belarus, fellow outlaw states Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, and a few stray countries like Nicaragua and Mali that back it up at the UN. And even a few of those countries are hesitant to back it fully. Russia's been burning through its military equipment quickly, with NATO weapons and a determined Ukrainian military tearing through the Cold War-era equipment. That has limited Russia to getting new weapons from its few remaining allies, with only Iran and North Korea having the arsenal needed to provide them with suitable weapons. But there is one wild card in the picture: China. Chinese leader Xi Jinping opened the war by emphasizing China's alliance with Putin, and most analysts viewed China as likely a long-term ally, due to them having a vested interest in the age of conquest returning. After all, if Putin conquered Ukraine and the world grudgingly accepted it, China would have a good chance of conquering Taiwan without global intervention. Needless to say, it did not work out that way. As the war ground on and it became clear Russia would not be overrunning Kyiv anytime soon, China started hedging its bets on whether they would aid Russia. During a recent United Nations vote calling on Russia to leave Ukraine, China abstained. Hardly a vote of confidence. But despite this, reports keep leaking out that China could be on the verge of giving Russia lethal weapons. Yet, they're always on the verge and never seem to take this step, at least as of February 2023. Instead, China continues to try to portray itself as a rational, neutral actor, even offering to mediate a peace deal with terms that were widely mocked by the West. So, why aren't they willing to aid another of the US's long-term rivals? Simply put, right now, backing Russia looks like a losing proposition. There's no indication that Russia is truly turning the corner, and China has heavy investments in the rest of the world. And while China has largely thumbed its nose at international law, the US does have one massive piece of leverage against it here: secondary sanctions. These sanctions target non-US persons or institutions that do business with a party under sanctions. This is usually used to target those doing business with Iran, but it could easily be expanded to those doing business with Russia if China decides to get more directly involved. And if China is going to risk that, it's definitely not going to be for a losing war. And it may not be in China's best interests right now. Analysts say that if China decides to give lethal aid to Russia, it would formally transform Ukraine into a proxy war and essentially kick off a full Cold War between the US and China, one that could easily turn hot. And if that's going to happen, China wants it to be on its timeline. That means Russia is largely on its own as it enters the next phase of the war. But Putin is acting as confident as ever. He's looking to intimidate the world, announcing a ramp-up in weapons and likely mobilization to try to push deeper into Ukrainian territory. But neither of these might work out how he's hoping. Another bad sign for Putin came shortly after he announced the withdrawal from the New START treaty. As Russia attempted to test a new intercontinental ballistic missile, there was clearly an attempt to intimidate the West and remind them that Russia could still hit them anywhere and at any time. Except that seemed like they really couldn't. The RS-28 Armata missile, known as the Satan II, could carry a 10-ton payload, but reportedly failed at liftoff this time. Russian media, of course, made no mention of the test, but insiders reported that it was yet another black eye for Russia. And it may not be the only area where things are collapsing. Russia's been heavily rumored to be preparing for a spring mobilization and surge full of shock and awe, designed to finish off the last of Ukrainian defenders in the east and begin the process of retaking the Black Sea and pushing toward Kyiv. But in recent weeks, the noise had quieted down, and while more Russian troops are flooding into Ukraine, they're mostly clustered around Bakhmut, where the Russians are slowly grinding down the opposition, but losing far more troops in the process, which means Russia will need more troops, and soon. During the last mobilization, Russia resorted to a draft, which led to the biggest anti-war protests the country had ever seen. The mobilization was largely seen as a disaster, as Russia relied heavily on ethnic minority groups, often drafting young professionals with no military experience and sending them to the front lines with only weeks of training, and got little for its efforts besides more war dead. So this time, Putin is taking a different approach, conducting what's being called a silent mobilization. The first draft is still technically in effect, but this wave seems to be conducted in small dribs and drabs to avoid public attention. This is probably the biggest sign yet that Putin realizes the public is no longer on his side. And for the first time, he's acting like it matters. But the biggest sign that the wheels are coming off the car for Putin might be happening not in Ukraine or Russia. In recent weeks, the discourse over the war has shifted away from the two warring countries to tiny Moldova, a former Soviet republic bordering Ukraine and Romania. While it doesn't border Russia, Russia actually does have a beachhead in the country. The region of Transnistria, a breakaway region that seeks independence with Russian backing. There are even Russian troops in the region, troops that could be used to surge into Ukraine and open a new front in the war. But right now, Moldova is concerned about something else. In recent weeks, Moldova saw its government collapse and Russian missiles fly over the small country. This was seen as part of a plot by Russia to collapse the government and replace the pro-Western leadership with a pro-Putin flag. But it failed utterly, as President Maia Sandu not only appointed a new pro-Western prime minister, but openly accused Putin of being behind a coup attempt and met with Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky to share details of Russia's plotting in the region. In the days after, Sandu reached out to NATO and the West for support, bringing the country closer to formally joining the alliance. Which means that the West isn't just aware of Putin's actions, they're not afraid of him anymore. In the past, Putin's intimidation has meant that he's able to run roughshod over the independence of former Soviet republics. The international community watched as he annexed Crimea with impunity and interfered in the politics of border nations repeatedly. They assumed that by letting him get away with it, it would keep him from embarking on a full war of conquest, which was proven wrong in Ukraine. Putin's goal of launching the war was creating a new world order, one where he could hold all of Europe at nuclear blackmail and begin recollecting the countries of the old Soviet Union. But that only happens when you win. The biggest sign that the war is going badly for Putin isn't that he's loudly withdrawing from treaties or quietly calling up soldiers without a full draft or begging China for help. It's that the invasion of Ukraine was largely designed to punish Ukraine for getting too close to the West and warn other countries from doing the same. Instead, more people are lining to join up than ever before, and a new world order is being shaped with Putin on the outside looking in. Its cannon can fire laser-guided anti-tank missiles. Its armor is impenetrable to anything but nuclear weapons. It can kill 10 American M1 Abrams standing front to back in a row with just one shot. If the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian military bloggers are to be believed, the T-14 is the deadliest tank ever created, past, present, and future. But if it's so good, why isn't it in Ukraine, where it's needed the most? The T-14 really is quite impressive, at least on paper. Then again, up until 8 months ago, the Russian military was also quite impressive on paper. If the T-14 was a paper tiger, though, it was one with some serious capital investment. We know, after 8 months of war, that the Russian government never lies. And we do know that the T-14 Armata has been announced in full production at least half a dozen times in the last 10 years. Originally, the Russian military was supposed to acquire 2,300 of these monsters between 2015 and 2020, making Western analysts absolutely brown their pants at the time, back when the West actually believed a single word coming out of the Kremlin. However, when 2015 rolled around, not a single T-14 had been delivered, and the tank was still in prototype testing. In 2016, some Western news outlets reported that the T-14 was in fact on its way to crush democracy. The National Interest ran a story on March 13, 2016 saying, "Surprise, Russia's lethal T-14 Armata tank is in production." The source for the article was a quote from a top Russian defense industry executive, or basically a "trust me, bro." Yet, 2016 came and passed without a single T-14 in active service, and by July 20th, 2018, Russia made the announcement that in effect indefinitely postponed any deliveries of T-14s, similar to the announcement made on the Su-57 Felon around that same time period. In 2021, Russian state-owned TASS media outlet reported that the tank would finally begin serial production in 2022, with serial production starting in December 2021. Mysteriously, not a single T-14 has been verified to be in active military service, though TASS did announce that the tank had been sent to Syria for testing in battlefield conditions. No other media in the world could verify this, and rumors circulating online that one T-14 was destroyed by Syrian rebels using an American TOW missile are also unverified. But let's wind the clock back and look at the background of the T-14, its alleged capabilities, and why Russia seems to be incapable of bringing these capabilities to a battlefield near you anytime soon. The T-14 was a seismic shift in Russian tank design. Back in 2010, Russia was developing the T-95, an upgrade over traditional Soviet-style tank designs. However, it was concluded that what Russia needed to be a relevant tank force in future conflicts was not an upgrade, but a complete evolutionary leap forward, leaving old Soviet tank design behind. The United States faced a similar problem back in the 1980s when it introduced the M1 Abrams. Originally, the US was simply going to continue evolving its M60 main battle tank, but the threat of overwhelming numbers of armed forces in Eastern Europe meant that it was time to throw the entire design out and work on something brand new. Like the M1 Abrams, it was built to face a specific threat, a defensive land battle against overwhelming numbers. The T-14 was born from discarded Soviet upgrades with the goal of building the tank around brand new technologies. It would be Russia's boldest leap forward in tank design for generations. While today it's easy to consider the Russian military laughable, the truth is Soviet designers knew what they were doing in making tanks. The Soviet Union fielded some truly fearsome tanks, many times superior to their Western counterparts. While the West held the advantage in the air and at sea, the Soviet Union was decisively the superior land power, perhaps not in doctrine but certainly in its armored forces. This expertise has continued to be handed down to modern Russia, and if at least half of its capabilities were real and not propaganda, it was a weapon to be feared. The T-14 would ditch traditional Soviet-style hulls to feature a more Western-style boxy turret and a low-profile body. This makes the T-14 a smaller target on the battlefield and can seriously improve crew safety by keeping them out of the line of fire. However, this redesign fixes one major flaw in nearly all tanks Russia has in service today, a flaw seen in full effect in Ukraine that has spawned an endless host of memes. Russian tanks store ammunition in the armored turret, which makes it easier for the autoloader to do its job. However, this also leaves the tank extremely vulnerable to top attack munitions, as any hit on the turret is guaranteed to light off this ammunition. In effect, Russian tanks have a tendency to blow their tops sky high and send the vaporized ashes of their crews into the stratosphere. Western designers, meanwhile, decided their tanks should be tanks and not rockets, and put the ammunition in the specially designed storage spaces with the blowout panels. The T-14 takes a cue from the West in this regard, much to the relief of Russian tankers, with no hopes of becoming astronauts one day. But the T-14 introduces a brand new feature that even the United States has yet to adopt. The turret can typically be a serious liability for the crew, and for it to do its job, it can't be as well armored as the rest of the body. That's bad news for the tank commander, whose seat is typically in the turret. However, the T-14 features an unmanned turret, which allows the crew to remote control it from the safety of their seats inside the body of the tank. In fact, the entire crew compartment is a densely protected armored capsule that the crew sits in, affording greatly increased survivability. The tank also features an upgraded barrel with increased range and lethality, as well as a host of modern upgrades including GPS, satellite communications, and even a meteorological mast to feed the environmental data to the fire control computer to greatly increase accuracy. So if the T-14 is so competent, why in the world isn't it in full production and storming the front lines in Ukraine today? Russia's attitude toward the T-14 appears to be a conundrum. The nation has gone to great lengths to tout its lethality and capabilities over even the most advanced Western designs, and is putting great effort into pressuring nations like India to buy it. Yet the Russian government seems completely uninterested in actually buying the tank itself. At the Army 2022 Expo, Rosoboronexport, the state-owned arms company that manufactures the Armata line of combat vehicles, was seen trying to garner international interest for the T-14s, while a TASS news article continued to speak out about its capabilities. Yet, instead of buying the revolutionary tank itself, Russia was trying to pawn it off on foreign buyers, a move that no doubt raised serious eyebrows from anyone considering buying the tank. The T-14 might arouse comparison to the Su-57, widely considered to be a dud and the worst of all fifth-generation fighter designs. The Su-57 was claimed to be superior to even US F-22s, the stealthiest fifth-generation fighter in the world, but this was demonstrably a lie. India, which was initially a partner in developing the Su-57, eventually pulled its funding from the program, citing serious questions about its effectiveness, stealth characteristics, and the ability to survive against other fifth-generation aircraft such as American F-22s and F-35s and Chinese J-20s. The pullout of Indian funding effectively killed Russia's ability to manufacture the Su-57, and to this day, only a little over a dozen of the aircraft are operational. However, while the Su-57 is on simple observation inferior in design to its counterparts, the T-14 appears to be the real deal and is backed by generations of Russian tank design know-how. The real reason why the Russian military might be passing on the tank is unlikely to be that it's a dud, but rather because Russia is facing the same problem the US was in the mid-2000s. With the turn of the millennium came a slew of revolutionary new military technologies and some serious spending around the world on developing and integrating them into active fighting forces. Nobody spent more than the US, which famously put nearly $20 billion into its Future Combat Systems program. However, all this tech came at serious cost to develop and purchase, and in the end, America's spending frenzy resulted in exactly 0 active surface weapon platforms. Instead, the US scaled back its ambitions and started spending on slow, incremental, and proven upgrades rather than moonshots. Russia seems to be facing the same issue, only on a budget the fraction the size of America's. And that means that Russia's dreams of a horde of 2,300 of this cutting-edge tank are simply financially impossible. Identifying these budgetary shortfalls as far back as 2016, Russia instead has been funneling money into modern upgrades for its existing tank fleet, rather than new acquisitions, and this left the T-14 without domestic support. So with a price tag of nearly $4 million each, the T-14 is a significant investment for any country, though it is still significantly behind America's Abrams, which comes in at nearly $10 million in the most modern variant. With a much smaller budget than the US, any hopes of acquiring the T-14 in large numbers were extremely unlikely in the past. Today, it is simply impossible. Sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine are having a significant economic impact, which has to date been delayed due to a massive war chest of over $300 billion that Putin had been holding in reserve for exactly this scenario. That money, originally as much as $700 billion, most of which was frozen in Western banks, is going to be running out soon though, and that's when Putin will be unable to offset the damage of the sanctions. So in other words, there's some very lean times ahead for the Russian military budget, especially as millions of professionals have left the country, further eroding its economy. The biggest death knell for Russia's acquisition of the T-14, however, and perhaps its ability to even manufacture it for foreign buyers should it find any, are sanctions targeting the nation's technology sector. The West and its partners around the world have in effect cut Russia off from the global technology market, making access to advanced electronic components the T-14 and other modern weapons need much more difficult and expensive. Russia is quite adept at sanction busting, but it's going to be impossible for the nation to illicitly get its hands on enough materials to build and maintain a fleet of over 2,000 high-tech tanks. Yet, we know Russia does have a small number of T-14s that it's been using for testing and prototyping. So why isn't it sending these to the front? The answer comes down to one simple comparison. A T-14 Armata tank costs approximately $4 million. A US Javelin anti-tank missile costs around $250,000. The US has supplied Ukraine with hundreds of this weapon system, and losing a single T-14 to a Javelin or British in-law is in effect an economic disaster in the making. Then, there is the huge loss in international prestige should Russia lose its most modern tank to a military that's supposed to be vastly inferior to itself. The same reason why we've yet to see the Su-57 in combat over Ukraine. It's not known how many T-14s Russia has actually built, but the number is believed to be less than 100. Even if Russia wanted to send them to the front lines, there's simply not enough of them to form operational units out of. Instead, these ultra-modern T-14s would find themselves fighting alongside much more dated models, making them vulnerable on the battlefield. With too few T-14s to be used effectively, Russia is best served by using its old tank stockpiles rather than sending their new tanks to certain destruction or simply abandonment in Ukraine. After all, the shame of having a Ukrainian farmer tow away Russia's most advanced tank with a tractor might be what finally does the Russian military in. In 1991, Ukraine declared itself independent as the Soviet Union collapsed around it. For years after, the new Russian Federation struggled to find its footing, and for a small time, there were hopes that the Cold War could be left in the past, and Russia would find its way to embracing better relationships with the West. However, those hopes were dashed with the election of President Vladimir Putin, a Cold War-era Soviet spy who was still stuck with a Cold War mentality. For Putin, the Soviet Union might have collapsed, but the dream of Soviet greatness wasn't dead, and the one thing standing between his dream and the new Russian Federation was the West. In Putin's eyes, Russia was forever locked in a zero-sum game with the West, and there could only be one victor. As the Soviet Union disintegrated, newly freed Soviet republics and former client states immediately sought out membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For those former republics and client states, it was the only way to guarantee their newfound independence after decades of brutal rule and oppression by the Kremlin. The Soviet Union might be gone, but nobody had any illusions about the Russian Federation suddenly wanting to be BFFs with the world, and the election of Vladimir Putin only reinforced a growing need for NATO membership. In 1990, NATO had promised that the alliance would not expand an inch to the east, yet this was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and clearly meant that the alliance wouldn't seek to expand into East Germany while the nation was divided. There had never been any discussions about NATO not expanding eastward toward Russia's borders after the collapse, as confirmed by Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. That doesn't mean that Russia didn't warn NATO about expanding, it's just that there was no formal agreement against expansion. For Russia, NATO expanding eastward triggered fears of past historical invasions of Russia by foreign powers. The nation has suffered greatly from foreign invaders, and thus after World War II, Stalin worked hard to ensure that Eastern Europe remained under his influence. Europe was thus divided along Germany, with the Soviet Union controlling everything in Europe east of Germany and using it as a security buffer between itself and the West. The buffer served two purposes. First, it was a physical barrier to invasion. After both German invasions and the invasion of the French during the Napoleonic War, Russia suffered great loss of life and damage to its economy. Eastern Europe was now a shield that protected the motherland, with any would-be invader having to pass through the entire Soviet bloc to reach Russian lands. Even better, millions of Eastern Europeans would themselves be thrown into war to protect the Soviet Union, placing the nation in the strongest position it's enjoyed since the heights of the Russian Empire. But this barrier was also an ideological one, meant to keep Western capitalist influence away from the Soviet homeland. The power of the Communist Party depended on keeping Stalinist ideology alive inside the Soviet Union. Liberal Western values and democracies threatened this. This has never been more true than it was post-2000s, after Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Liberal Western values are now seen as an infection in Russia because they threaten President Putin's absolute power on the Russian government. For Putin, Russia today is under assault by Western culture, and he spent great efforts in waging a propaganda war both within and outside its borders. The last thing Putin or his elites want is a free, democratic Russia, and the only way they can prevent the ever-brewing political unrest amongst the population is by creating boogeymen out of the West to unite the Russians against. Starting in the early 2010s, Ukraine now wished to draw itself closer economically and politically with the West, much to Putin's dissatisfaction. At first, there was a wish to be more economically tied to the West to ensure Ukraine's prosperity, but as Russia exerted more pressure on Ukraine, a growing movement to formally join NATO grew inside Ukraine. Putin attempted to suppress this desire through intimidation and by using propaganda inside of Ukraine, even by infiltrating its government. In 2014, the situation came to a crisis point when President Viktor Yanukovych, a Putin stooge, refused to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union, which would have drawn Ukraine deeper into the West's fold both economically and politically. Instead, President Yanukovych ignored the Ukrainian parliament's overwhelming desire to sign this agreement and chose to draw closer to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, headed by the Russian Federation and made up of former Soviet states. The result was immediate, as protesters took to the streets and a full-blown civil insurrection threw Kyiv into chaos. The Ukrainian people had freed themselves from Russian rule and had no wish to go back to being a mere client state, and brutal clashes took place between protesters and police. The Revolution of Dignity, as it came to be known, resulted in the occupation of the government buildings across Ukraine and the expulsion of President Viktor Yanukovych from power. Soon after, Yanukovych went into exile in Russia, and Russia responded to the coup by taking Crimea and supporting the breakaway provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia orchestrated pro-Russian demonstrations in Sevastopol, and 4 days later, Russian troops without insignia stormed into the parliament of Crimea and seized it, while other Russian troops took key strategic sites along the peninsula. With the peninsula secure, the Russian Federation installed the pro-Russian Sergei Aksyonov into power. Shortly after, there was a referendum that resulted in 97% of voters choosing for Crimea to be absorbed by the Russian Federation. Perhaps unsurprisingly, those votes were never verified by any independent agency, and the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to consider the referendum illegal. Thus, to this day, internationally, Crimea is still considered as belonging to Ukraine. But with Vladimir Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons, nobody sought to use military force to liberate the occupied peninsula. At the same time that Russian forces were seizing Crimea, Russia's infamous Little Green Men, so-called for their green insignia-less uniforms, moved into the separatist regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. working alongside separatists and even engaging in fighting themselves. Russia denied allegations that its military was in the separatist regions, but the ruse was all but given up over time, as even Russian armor joined the fighting against Ukrainian forces. The Donbas War, as it came to be known, would rage until 2022, culminating in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The real question is, though, what does President Vladimir Putin really want to do with Ukraine when the war is all over? The answer depends on how the war ends. The least likely way that this war ends is with a full occupation of Ukraine by Russian forces. Initially, Putin claimed that he had no intention of occupying any part of Ukrainian territory, and that his advance on Kyiv was merely meant to remove what he called pro-Western Nazi government from power. In the early stages of war, this might have been true. Putin may truly have not wished to physically occupy Ukraine, and instead settled for installing a puppet government. This would turn Ukraine into a client state, much like Belarus, without the hassle of having to pacify an inevitable insurrection by physically occupying it. It would also achieve its grand aim of weakening NATO by denying it yet another member, especially one situated right on Russia's soft southern belly. However, as the Russian advance into Kyiv faltered and then failed entirely, Putin's strategy seemed to radically change as well. Accepting that he would be unable to take Kyiv and topple the government, Russian forces instead focused on breaking out of the separatist regions and seizing the all-important Ukrainian southern coast along the Sea of Azov. With this coastline firmly under Russia's control, Vladimir Putin now has a land corridor from Russia straight to Crimea, and Crimea's water supply can no longer be threatened by Ukrainian dams, as had happened after the annexation, when Ukraine blocked Crimea's drinking water in retaliation to the invasion. This land corridor, however, also gives Russia complete control over the Sea of Azov, essentially turning it into a Russian lake. Putin's forces now try to push north and west out of the land corridor and seem to want to take as large a chunk of Ukraine as possible. What's more important, however, is extending a corridor to the west, all the way to Odessa and the Moldovan border. This would give Russia complete control over Ukraine's shipping ports and thus allow it to choke off Ukraine economically, but also allow it to link up with its forces inside the Moldovan breakaway region of Transnistria. Russia currently has 1,500 personnel there, and it's greatly feared that linking a land corridor across southern Ukraine will allow it to move more forces into the region and eventually take all of Moldova. This will give Russia control over half of the Black Sea and extend a security buffer out from Russia's vulnerable southern regions in case of a war with NATO. It's now certain that Putin wishes to completely annex occupied territories inside of Ukraine, as starting May 1st, the ruble was introduced as the official currency in the occupied areas that remain relatively stable and in Russian hands. Street and building signs were also all taken down and replaced with their Russian equivalent, and Russia guaranteed the pension payments of Ukrainian pensioners living in the territories. Even more importantly, Russian state TV was brought to the occupied territories, allowing Russia to feed those living under occupation a steady stream of Russian propaganda. Putin's goal is now territorial expansion, and it seems as if his plans for Ukraine hinge on what happens next in the war. Russian forces seem incapable of truly taking the whole of Ukraine, and the commitment by the West, especially the United States, to arm the Ukrainians makes it a complete impossibility that Russia will be able to take over the entire country. However, Russian forces may be able to seize that all-important land corridor to Moldova and take Odessa, even though this is in question, seeing as 3 months into the war, Russia is yet to bring Mariupol under its full control. Further west, Kherson is a critically important city to capture, and as of the writing of this video, Ukrainian forces are launching successful counterstrikes against Russian forces around the city. This makes a breakout to Odessa extremely unlikely, but this isn't Russia's only problem. Corruption and incompetence across all levels of the Russian military have resulted in massive casualties and great loss of equipment in the invasion. The effects of these losses on Russia's ability to continue fighting are only compounded by the astounding amount of sanctions levied against Russia by the international community. Of greatest importance, though, are those targeting Russia's foreign reserves, which fund the war, and of which half have been frozen by Western governments. Of second most importance is the complete ban on selling electronic components to Russia, which are desperately needed by its military to rearm itself with 21st century weapons. Already, Russian drones and other advanced weapons are being discovered with computer chips ripped out of coffee makers and dishwashers, and Russian jet fighters have been discovered with commercial GPS devices taped to the dash. With the West feeding Ukraine a steady diet of high-tech Western weapons, and with Russia's own stockpile of advanced equipment drying up, it's becoming increasingly impossible for Russia to truly win inside Ukraine. As Europe is committed to an incremental ban on Russian energy imports over the next year or so, Russia's economic situation will only grow more desperate, and its ability to continue this conflict will be in serious jeopardy. Russia is thus likely to attempt to settle the war by holding on to territories it's managed to secure, adding them to the Russian Federation, and weakening Ukraine. Ukraine itself has been willing to compromise by becoming a neutral nation, with neutrality enshrined in its constitution and thus seeking no closer ties to the West. However, Ukraine wishes to have guarantor states sign this neutrality agreement, with nations legally bound to come to Ukraine's defense in case of another Russian invasion. Yet, as reports of Russian brutality against civilians continue to surface from occupied areas, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has stated that he is less and less interested in such a deal. Ultimately, unless Russia achieves some miraculous battlefield reversals, Putin's future plans for Ukraine may not matter at all. 1 year into the war in Ukraine, and Russia's facing the greatest challenges it's faced over 40 years. But new developments might just doom its efforts to win in Ukraine. When it comes to Russia's problems in Ukraine, the list is exhaustive. But lately, one problem has been hampering its efforts to launch the dreaded spring offensive most Western analysts had feared would come. The Russian Ministry of Defense has done a good job of pumping out a steady stream of propaganda fuel meant to paint a widely inaccurate picture of the situation in Ukraine. According to Russian MOD videos put out on a nearly daily basis, Russian troops are on the move across the east, steadily pushing back overwhelmed Ukrainian forces as they break under the weight of Russian tanks and helicopters. When not showing heavily edited videos of their troops engaged in glorious combat, the Russian MOD shares videos of one of their fancy statues decapitating America's Lady Liberty in a one-on-one duel. Russia's taken Internet Tough Guy to a completely different level. But videos coming from the troops themselves paint a wildly different picture of the situation on the ground for the Russian army. Since last fall, a steady stream of videos made by troops requesting aid from various government officials have hit the internet. The format's always the same. A group of Russian soldiers stands together, typically hiding their faces for fear of reprisal, and then they record a video airing their grievances.
Обращение в военную прокуратуру Российской Федерации, Министерство обороны Российской Федерации. Мы мобилизованы из Тюменской области, были призваны осенью и зачислены в батальон 1641 «Росомаха», где проходили обучение в течение 3-5 месяцев по своим должностям. По приезду на Украину 4-я рота была раскидана по частям ДНР и смена наших вузов без нашего согласия. Мы пытаемся на месте выяснить, но все безрезультатно.
These grievances are pretty much the same. Like in the previous video where the mobilized soldiers receive specialized training only to be thrown straight into the front lines upon arriving in Ukraine. It's a complaint that is increasingly common as the 300,000 conscripts mobilized by Russia in response to Ukraine's stunningly successful counteroffensive have been joining the war in force. Initially, a group of these Mobics were simply thrown directly to the front with little to no training.
We've got this shit for training. Knows what kind of house we're at. 3 armor-piercing cartridges. We're in Svatov, you guys.
Мы в Сватово находимся. Какая область?
Луганская.
What region? Luhansk region. We are mobilized. We don't have to be here at all. 11 days from when we were deployed. We left Moscow 11 days ago. How many times did you shoot already? Once. 3 bullet cartridges.
This wasn't an accident, though. It was the same type of sadistic tactical thinking that's prevailed in Russia since the earliest days of the Soviet Union. With the front line across the north of the country collapsing, Russia needed to throw bodies at the problem until the line stabilized, and it accomplished this, sacrificing as many as an estimated 25,000 mobilized conscripts who'd received at best a week of training. In Russia, life is cheap, and sacrificing men for time is simple strategic doctrine for Russian commanders. As the wars progressed, a steady stream of videos from Russians complaining about their situation has hit the internet. The intent is typically a cry for help. Men mobilized with little training, either complaining about a lack of leadership, equipment, or about being trained in one specialty only to be used as cannon fodder. Some Russian soldiers have even been transferred under the command of separatist units and inevitably being used as disposable cannon fodder to soften up Ukrainian positions.
Обращаются к вам мобилизованные Иркутской области полка 1439, отправленные в ДНР с города Новосибирска 31 декабря 2022 года. Просим посодействовать и разобраться с беззаконным и преступными приказами нашего командования. Они заключаются в том, что нас передали в подчинение 1-й славянской бригаде ДНР, где из нас солдат территориальной обороны за 1 день сформировали штурмовые
The soldiers typically complain of lacking equipment or proper support, and then in the previous video of literally being called disposable by their new commanders. The videos are almost always directed at President Vladimir Putin himself or some other authority from their home region. What's especially pathetic is the belief by these troops that Vladimir Putin gives a single damn about any of them and would respond to these videos with anything but immediate punishment. In fact, we have multiple reports of Russian soldiers being imprisoned for refusing to follow orders that would send them to their deaths or recording similar videos calling for help. No matter how hard Russia tries to hide the truth from its population, though, news of how bad things are going inevitably reach back home. Soldiers are increasingly having their phones confiscated upon entering Ukraine, but many of them simply hide them or write highly critical letters back home. Others steal Ukrainian phones to dial home with. The wounded also bring stories back to the home front of just how bad conditions are in Ukraine. This inevitably has even led Russian citizens to making the same style of videos publicly asking for help. More often than not, the videos are addressed to local politicians, such as in this one recorded by the wives of men mobilized and sent to fight against armored vehicles and even tanks with little heavy equipment to support them.
Мы жены мобилизованных города Бийска. Наши мужья прикомандированы к 55-й бригаде, Республика Тыва, город Кызыл.
Ротный Маклаков, мобилизованный с города Бийска. Командир Кочнев.
Просим отозвать наших мужей с линии соприкосновений село Житловка.
Unsurprisingly, some of these videos are addressed by concerned wives directly to the commander-in-chief himself. Like in this video, where the women say that they've been ignored by their local authorities. They even complain of having been blocked on the popular Telegram app by both local politicians and the Russian Ministry of Defense. The women complain of a lack of training for their mobilized men and of the extremely unsanitary conditions on the Ukrainian front. Men with chronic diseases are not receiving adequate care, and the women feel that they have no recourse but to appeal to Putin himself. In another video, wives of men attached to DPR separatist forces complain of their men purposefully being used as cannon fodder, while the DPR forces themselves don't commit any of their men to such dangerous assaults.
Мы надеемся на вашу помощь. Наши мужья и сыновья были прикомандированы к одной из частей армии в Донецкой Народной Республике, после чего жены стали получать тревожные звонки от своих мужей, в каждом из которых...
The callous disregard for the lives of Russian soldiers is staggering. A Western unit being placed under the command of a foreign force and then used as cannon fodder would be enough to start a riot back home. Good thing democracy is fake in Russia, or else Putin would be in hot water come this next election cycle. The steady stream of videos from both men at the front and their wives and mothers back home are all eating away at Russian civilian morale. Just like their military, a civilian population's morale is critical to a successful campaign, as a demoralized population will become increasingly harder to control, let alone mobilize and order into combat. But complaints from the front aren't the only bad news Russia is dealing with, as the military itself is narrowly avoiding all-out war against itself. For months now, the Wagner mercenary group, now officially labeled a terrorist organization by the United States for their many human rights abuses, has been leading the charge across the East. What few successes Russia has had against determined Ukrainian defenders have largely been thanks to Wagner. But now it looks as if Wagner and the Russian military are on the splits, and it's causing more damage than the Kanye-Kim K split. Wagner leader and shoe-in for Lurch in a Russian remake of Addams Family, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has famously been beefing like a butcher with the entire Russian military establishment, claiming that it was his force that stemmed the Ukrainian onslaught last autumn. Prigozhin, who has a face for radio, has been clearly making a serious power play in the Kremlin. Most analysts believe he wishes to be appointed Minister of Defense, replacing resident bad boy, and we mean bad as in he's terrible at his job, Sergei Shoigu. Thus, Prigozhin has been using his access to Putin and his successes on the battlefield to try to diminish and belittle Shoigu and the Russian military on the whole. But it seems Prigozhin bit off more borscht than he could chew, and now Shoigu seems to have all but neutered Wagner inside of Ukraine. The drama started to unfold with the taking of Soledar, a minor town that Russia hailed as a military victory of the millennium. And to be fair, for the Russians, taking a small salt mining town successfully really was the victory of the millennium. Wagner claimed responsibility for the victory, even posting a photo of themselves inside one of the salt mines. However, the Russian MOD announced that it had been the Russian military, not Wagner, who had accomplished this great feat of which military historians will speak about for days to come. Prigozhin's dreams of being compared to the likes of Alexander the Great for taking a salt mine would crumble like, well, salt, as the MOD took all the credit. Evidence strongly suggests that it had indeed been Wagner, using human wave attacks of recruited prisoners who had in fact been largely responsible for taking the town. However, it's likely that the MOD badly needed a propaganda victory to prove to the population back home that its military was not in fact complete clown shoes. It's even more likely, however, that Shoigu is finally launching a counterattack against Prigozhin's political machinations. To the surprise of everyone, but probably not one more than Prigozhin himself, Putin seemed to back up Shoigu, and Wagner's contributions to the victory were quickly erased from Russian media. In fact, most mentions of Wagner began to disappear from Russian media, and it wasn't long after that reports of Wagner being shunned on the battlefield began to surface. According to Wagner officials, the Russian army has refused to share supplies with Wagner or even support their assaults with artillery. It seems like Shoigu is set out to destroy his political rival, but that hasn't stopped Prigozhin and his well-funded Wagner PMC from continuing to claim victories, especially around Bakhmut. Recently, Wagner announced it had captured several villages outside of Bakhmut itself, which came as a great surprise to the Ukrainian soldiers currently sitting in those villages, defending them. Prigozhin, which has long enjoyed Putin's close support, has seemingly been put out in the cold. But did Prigozhin miscalculate the relationship between Shoigu and Putin? Or were his constant complaints about the Russian military even too much for Putin to take? Having an insider criticize the military in a way that no propagandist on Russian TV would dare to was likely too much for Putin to continue to allow. But it's also possible that Putin doesn't truly favor Shoigu or Prigozhin over the other. For a dictator, the only thing more important than ensuring the loyalty of the men under you is ensuring that they hate each other even more. That's the only way to prevent a palace coup. And given the increasing cost to Russia from Putin's disastrous invasion, a coup is very likely high on his list of worries at the moment. Complaining soldiers, citizens taking to the internet to publicly air their grievances, and now the Russian military beefing with the most successful part of the Russian invasion. With all the problems facing Putin, the West just added a 60-ton complication. At the start of the war, Ukraine immediately requested heavy equipment such as tanks. The West was slow to respond, then gradually rounded up as many Soviet-era tanks as they could wrangle from NATO's Eastern European counterparts. It was clear that those would soon run out, though, and despite many extremely generous donations by the Russians themselves, Ukraine would need a continual and steady supply of tanks. This left only one option: modern Western vehicles. But many in the West immediately browned themselves at the thought of making Vladidadi angry by giving Ukraine the tools it needed to defend itself and stop the slaughter of civilians. Slowly, gradually, and despite an incessant stream of threats about escalation, the West at last decided to supply Ukraine with main battle tanks. Now, an estimated 100 Leopard 2s and American Abrams are on their way to Ukraine and, after training, will be on the battlefield by the start of the summer. The U.S. Abrams will take longer to deliver and train on, but the Leopard 1s and Leopard 2s are already in the hands of Ukrainian tank crews training in Poland. While the tanks being sent lack many of the most sophisticated and classified features of those in use by Western armies, they are still a considerable threat to Russia. The U.S. said it'll be stripping the secretive depleted uranium armor used in its tanks and replacing it likely with titanium composite. However, even with the downgraded armor, Western tanks are in effect punching down versus Russia's dwindling stockpile of armored vehicles. Recent reports state that Russia has started fielding T-62s in large numbers, and while Russia will continue to enjoy the numbers advantage, Ukraine will soon enjoy the quality advantage. And quality means a lot here because a Leopard 2 against a T-62 is like pitting a bare-knuckle boxing champion against a senile geriatric with hip issues. Russia is thus trying to do its best to destroy these Western tanks before they even get to Ukraine, by targeting you. Putin knows that he can't defeat large numbers of Western tanks on the battlefield, so instead, he's turned to feeding the West a steady diet of propaganda and fear-mongering. He knows the West fears he will escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, and thus has worked hard to make sure the word escalation has been on the lips of every Western news anchor. At this point, if you turn the lights off and say the word escalation 3 times into a mirror, a bloody apparition of Vladimir Putin will appear and threaten to nuke you. Putin's only chance to defeat Western weapons is to make sure they're never sent at all, which is bad news, as it appears that the West is slowly unbrowning their collective panties and starting to send Ukraine the weapons it needs to end the war. With the first delivery of 100 tanks, nations like the US have strongly hinted at ongoing support, which Ukraine will need as battlefield losses mount. Western tanks might be far more capable than what Russia is currently fielding, but inevitably these tanks will be damaged or destroyed, which is why it's critical that the West continue to deliver replacements for the duration of the war. The tank that makes the most sense to send is the Leopard 2, but sadly most European countries are reluctant to deplete their own stockpiles in case of a war, which we're forced to ask the question, what war exactly? Putin's forces are already heavily embroiled in Ukraine, and if his military is unable to conquer even the east of Ukraine, we doubt the Russian T-72s are going to be rolling past the Eiffel Tower and into Madrid anytime soon. So maybe the Western NATO states need to start asking themselves, what war exactly do they think they need tanks for when Ukraine is literally holding the line on the war they fear? Ironically, the NATO members most at risk of Russian aggression have been the ones to be the most generous with their support. The Baltic states and Poland have been pulling a great deal of their own equipment from active service to send to Ukraine, with Poland threatening to send its Leopards to Ukraine even without Germany's approval. Poland's been so proactive that when at the start of the war Europe said it would make Putin sad if they supplied Ukraine with jets, Poland went ahead and sent MiG fighters under the guise of spare parts. Slowly but surely, the West is losing its fear of hurting Putin's feelings, and the announcement of tanks for Ukraine was followed by another shipment of HIMARS from the US. Included in new shipments are long-range munitions capable of striking deep behind enemy lines, exactly the type of weapons Ukraine has been asking for since the war began. An aid package announced at the start of February included the US's Ground-Launched Small Diameter Bomb, or GLSDB. This weapon has a range of up to 93 miles and consists of a 250-pound bomb attached to a rocket booster. Boosted high up into the sky, the bomb detaches from the spent rocket and deploys wings that it uses to glide to its target, resulting in a greatly extended range. This will nearly double Ukraine's current HIMARS range and can be fired from existing HIMARS units or MLRS systems. The bomb itself was the result of the US having entirely too many 250-pound bombs just lying around. At some point, someone, probably from Georgia or Alabama, got the idea to strap all these spare bombs to a rocket and then give them wings, and the results speak for themselves. The bombs are precision-guided with jam-resistant GPS technology and come in the high-explosive fragmentation or bunker-busting varieties. These weapons will allow Ukraine to push Russian logistics even further away from the front lines, slowing down the ability to launch offensives even more. By making resupply difficult, Ukraine can overwhelm Russian units on the front despite their superior numbers. But just as importantly, it'll force Russian air defenses to attempt to shoot down these bombs, expending valuable air defense missiles. With tanks on their way, Ukraine has taken to breaking down the remaining barriers to giving Ukraine the fighter jets it's been asking for. While Ukraine would never get top-of-the-line Western jets like the F-35, even F-16s would be a significant threat to the Russian Air Force. And as one of the most successful aircraft ever built, there's thousands of F-16s that could potentially be sent to Ukraine. But Ukraine has asked for only 200 of them. And even that's a bold figure given how reluctant the West has been to give anything but small arms. Opposition to sending the F-16 to Ukraine is currently strong, but many countries have signaled a willingness to send jets. As of February 22nd, the US was firmly rejecting the idea of sending any F-16s. But just like the tanks seemed an impossibility at one point, odds are that as the war drags on, Western jets will make an appearance in the skies over Ukraine. With Western jets, Ukraine could challenge Russia's air forces and prevent at least some of the attacks launched against its civilian population. Trying to operate them on the front would be foolhardy, but armed with standoff weapons of their own, F-16s or similar platforms could significantly increase the reach of Ukrainian weapons. It would also prevent Russia from operating close to the front itself, where it's enjoyed greater use of air support than Ukraine. Putin's problems are numerous and seem to be growing by the day. Sadly, though, the longer the West hesitates to send weapons to Ukraine, the more Ukrainian soldiers and civilians die at the hands of the Russian invaders. The war in Ukraine continues to rage on. Russia seems to have no intention of backing down, as Putin is predicted to order another round of mobilization. Seems like nothing can stop him. Nothing, that is, besides maybe Mother Nature. And if Putin is on his last legs, it might very well be bad news for the whole world. Putin is not a young man. In his 70s, most men his age are likely looking forward to retirement instead of conquest. While he'd like to brag about his perfect health and fitness in the past, often posting dramatic pictures of himself engaged in physical activities or riding horses, he seems to have dialed back in recent years. In fact, he's rarely seen in public at all anymore, and rumors are circling that he might be sick, very sick. There's not much information coming out of Russia at the moment, with the government even more tight-lipped than usual. What the media usually gets is loosely sourced reports saying that Putin is seeing a doctor, that he's undergoing experimental treatments, and that he's hiding away from the public eye because his appearance has changed for the worse. After all, Putin's reputation as an unstoppable warrior is one of his best assets. But according to intelligence sources, the situation might be more dire. The head of Denmark's Russian Military Intelligence Division spoke to an interviewer and said that while he didn't believe Putin was terminally ill, he did believe the Russian leader had cancer and was likely undergoing hormone treatments. Putin likely has access to the best care money can buy, but those treatments can result in weight gain, which might explain why Putin is keeping himself hidden. But according to another source, the situation might be even worse. The head of Ukraine's Military Intelligence Division, Kirilo Budanov, spoke bluntly to the media in recent months and said that Putin wasn't just sick, he was dying of terminal cancer and likely wouldn't live to see the end of the war one way or another. Is this accurate? No one knows, and disinformation is a key part of war. So if Ukrainians can make people think Putin is dying, it might help demoralize the Russian army. The few recent glimpses of Putin we got recently didn't help his image, with him stumbling across the Red Square and looking rather frail and lethargic. So if Putin is on his last legs, is the war as well? Unfortunately, real life usually isn't like the movies, and the defeat or death of a villain doesn't often mean the end of the crisis. In fact, Putin's ill health might just make him more dangerous than ever, because he has nothing left to lose. Putin comes from a different era of Russia, growing up in the heyday of the USSR and rising to a powerful position in its spy services. Then, as a young man, he watched it decline and ultimately collapse, losing large swaths of its territory in Europe and Asia. And that might be a big part of his motivation for invading Ukraine, restoring Russia to its former glory. And he couldn't think of a better final act. Russia is already the largest country in the world, but during its heyday it was much bigger. During the collapse, Russia lost almost a quarter of its territory and with it almost half of its population and 40% of its gross national product. According to many Russian hardliners, all that territory is rightfully Russian and it should be taken back by any means necessary. While Putin has so far contained his rage to one country, a ticking clock on his final mission might mean all bets are off. And that could mean a much larger war. Right now, Putin has been careful not to start an open war with NATO. While NATO provides many of the weapons Ukraine uses in the war, they've refused to give Ukraine any weapons that could directly hit Moscow. Likewise, Moscow has not attacked any NATO shipments until they arrive in Ukraine. And the one missile strike that did hit Poland turned out to be a tragic friendly fire incident. However, if Putin decides it's now or never, he could start retaliating directly against NATO, or even try to conquer countries like Poland, which were once behind the Iron Curtain. According to NATO doctrine, if one nation is attacked, all NATO nations are bound to aid its defense, which could mean World War III. And things could escalate quickly if Putin makes the wrong decision. If he feels like he has nothing left to lose, could Putin be tempted to resort to nuclear weapons? That's the fear everyone has, and no doubt something he wants to leverage to achieve his goals. But it's less likely than it appears. Putin might not feel he has any other options, but millions of Russians do, and it's unlikely any nuclear exchange between Russia and NATO would stay limited. This could endanger the whole Russian homeland. Putin hasn't been moved at all by past protests against his rule, but if he loses the faith of his generals, all bets are off. If Putin's illness makes him more eager to start World War III, even if it means nothing outlives him anywhere, the end could come for him faster than he expects. But even if Putin is removed from power, things might still not turn out well. There's no question that Vladimir Putin is at the bullseye center of all this trouble going on in Europe right now, but he's far from alone. While many people who hold power within Russia had doubts about the plans to invade Ukraine, they're also not likely to become peaceniks or reformers in the aftermath. That means that Putin's departure, if pulled off smoothly, would mean that the overall policies might not change that much, and in some cases, things might get worse. In the United States, if President Biden becomes incapacitated or leaves office, everyone knows Vice President Harris is next in line. In a parliamentary democracy, like the United Kingdom, it's a little more complicated, but there's still a plan. The party picks the new leader, and they immediately take office. That's what we saw when Boris Johnson was forced to resign and was replaced by Liz Truss. For a few weeks before her incompetent tenure saw her step down by public demand and then be replaced by Rishi Sunak. Hey, we said there was a plan, we didn't say it would be orderly. But it's a very different story in Russia. Putin took over from Russia's first democratically elected leader, Boris Yeltsin, and has won almost every election since then. So far, it's become very clear he has no intention of leaving office by democratic means. Most elections in Russia are formalities, with pro-democracy parties outlawed, and only the Communist Party allowed to provide token opposition. When he was term limited out, he did step down, long enough for his second-in-command, Dmitry Medvedev, to take over, repeal those term limits, and then step aside for Putin to run in the next election. That means the plan for Putin's successor might be no plan at all. If Putin leaves in a hurry, either by sudden death or incapacitation due to illness or due to a coup by his own insiders, the results could be pure chaos. There are no shortage of powerful Russian figures who want the power that Putin has been keeping to himself like smog on the lonely mountain for over 20 years. It's been a long time since control of Russia was up for grabs, and there's no way of knowing just how bad things could get. And it all depends on which faction takes control. If Putin's around to choose his successor, the likely candidates are going to be hardliners as well. On paper, Medvedev seems likely to take over his boss's position for a second time, this time permanently. And the longtime Russian functionary has been playing it up for the camera. His threatening statements toward the West have often been more extreme than Putin's, but many outsiders believe this is a show. After all, Medvedev is playing up his image for an audience. But it's believed he's more pragmatic and political than the ruthless Putin, which might mean he's not Putin's choice after all. In recent years, another figure has grown closer to Putin, Nikolai Patrushev, the former head of the FSB spy agency and the current secretary of the Security Council of Russia. He comes from a similar background as ex-spy Putin and is believed to be whispering hardline sentiments in Putin's ear. The conspiratorial Patrushev believes the West is working to bring about the end of Russia and might have been collecting evidence on foreign leaders and countries for years. As Putin's confidant, he might be chosen as Putin's successor so the war in Ukraine could continue to rage on. But at only a few years younger than Putin, he'll no doubt have many younger and hungrier figures looking to displace him. But if Putin doesn't get to pick his successor, all bets are off. If Putin was deemed to be incapacitated, unstable, or otherwise a danger to Russia, he could potentially be couped by his own inner circle, although this could be incredibly dangerous due to how protected Putin is and how likely he is to view any attempt to remove him from power as an attack from the West. But if he is successfully removed, he's likely to be replaced by an experienced military leader, someone like Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, seen as a more pragmatic but fiercely patriotic Russian figure. So is he likely to bring an end to the war in Ukraine? Unfortunately, that's not likely. While Shoigu is seen as a more stable figure than Putin, he's also a ruthless military leader. He's taken a lot of criticism for his handling of the war in Russia, but many believe he's not fully pulling the strings, rather carrying out Putin's orders. If the strong military man, a member of the Tuvan minority group from Siberia, manages to take control, it could lead to a similar situation to when Joseph Stalin was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. The United States would get a new Russian leader who is less overtly cruel but more effective at the larger geopolitical game. It's likely that the war in Ukraine and the larger conflict wouldn't end, but it would rather enter a new stage, one where Russia might be more willing to take its time. But a coup is a dangerous prospect. It could trigger a chaotic power struggle. There are a lot of people who would love to take over once things boil over into total chaos, and the removal of Putin could cause a mass public revolt that would lead to a full change of regime. Similar to the way Mikhail Gorbachev's liberalization led to a coup attempt and ultimately the rise of Yeltsin and the fall of the Soviet Union. If a coup leads to a vulnerable Shoigu in charge, he could find himself displaced by a more democracy-friendly leader, like moderate Moscow mayor Sergei Sobyanin, or even imprisoned opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Both these scenarios, while ideal outcomes, are highly unlikely. Coups are times of chaos, and chaos favors wolves. One figure who might be looking to take advantage of the chaos is the most ruthless and brutal of Putin's warlords, the Chechen commander, Ramzan Kadyrov. A leader of the Muslim minority group that Putin brutally repressed earlier in his reign, Kadyrov has taken command of the region and is fiercely loyal to Putin, while going far further than him in his rhetoric toward the West. In recent weeks, he's called for invading Poland once Ukraine is conquered, the definition of wishful thinking. While Kadyrov is one of the most dangerous of Putin's inner circle, he would likely have trouble building the support needed to become Russia's first Muslim leader. It's more likely he would seek to be a kingmaker in exchange for more concessions to Chechnya. And then there might be one figure who has even him beat in brutality. Unlike the other contenders to replace Putin, Yevgeny Prigozhin isn't a Russian official. In fact, he's a private businessman. And despite that, he's one of the most powerful men in Russia as the head of the Wagner Group, a massive mercenary company that has been doing much of the heavy lifting in the war in Ukraine. Prigozhin doesn't have many of the advantages of other leaders, as he's unlikely to be trusted enough by any coup leaders. But what he does have is a massive private army that may only be loyal to him. And if he's able to take advantage of a chaotic situation to stage a military coup, the largest nuclear arsenal in the world would fall into the hands of a mercenary known as secretive and ruthless. So a healthy Putin might be a terrifying prospect to anyone hoping to see a quick end to the war in Ukraine, but a sick Putin might lead to much worse scenarios ranging from optimistic to downright apocalyptic. A woman weeps at the coffin of her dead son Alexei. She'd last seen him alive just a few weeks before when he was recruited to serve in Ukraine. He had no combat experience whatsoever. After merely a few days of training, he joined the Semyonovsky Regiment on the front line. 2 weeks later, his mother was told he died heroically for his country. Alexei's story is a true one, and just one of the problems plaguing Russia's military right now. Poor training, dare we say criminally inadequate training, is one reason Russia's military is failing right now. It's the prominent reason why young men like Alexei are getting to the battlefield and thinking out loud, "I don't know what to do." It's why some men don't want to be there. At times, the proverbial blind have led the blind. Suffice it to say, the effect on troop morale has been devastating. We'll talk about declining morale in depth soon. First, we want to discuss hardware issues. Russia has a lot of them, and Ukraine has a lot of help in the hardware department. The aid parade for Ukraine has become an ever-expanding phenomenon. In terms of military spending, Russia is one of the highest spending countries in the world. In 2021, it placed 5th on the list of the highest defense budgets behind the UK, India, China, and the US. The amount of money it spent was reported to be $65.9 billion. The US was a whopping $800.7 billion. Things have changed somewhat since those budgets were planned. Reuters reported in September 2022 that Russia plans to spend $600 billion on defense and security by 2025. How can Russia even afford that? Over in the US, it was reported in June that a Senate Armed Services Committee voted to approve military spending of $858 billion for 2023. The Defense Secretary in the UK has also said that the country, in spite of current economic woes and now pervasive food banks, will dramatically increase its military spending. In terms of percentage of its GDP, Russia spends more on defense than the other top spenders, although the US isn't too far behind. For 2021, Ukraine spent around $5 billion on defense, which was more of its GDP than Russia, the US, and the UK spent in relation to their GDP. Even so, Russia will soon be spending a ton of money. It's people's money, money it doesn't have. This will be problematic. As a British journalist said recently, Russia can't afford Putin's war in Ukraine. Money, or lack thereof, is a major issue for Russia, especially as the time goes on. And notice how the journalist called it Putin's war, not Russia's war. The emphasis on Putin is very important. It isn't the first time that Russia is straining its finances to retain some political authority in the world. The country was economically unstable since the end of the Cold War. Vladimir Putin, who would soon be on good terms with the US, only came to power because he unofficially agreed not to go after the oligarchs who took advantage of the chaos that came after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That was okay with the West. Just to give you an example of what we mean, 22 years ago when Putin was Russia's acting president, he was described in the New York Times Magazine with the words utterly professional, a star, sensitive, a man we can do business with, a liberal, humane, and decent European. Meanwhile, the Russian people watched on as their country was being pillaged. Many discerning people distrusted Putin, as well as the Western capitalists. This is important to understand for the show today. The Russian public does not want to suffer like that again. Many of them are not supportive of another costly war, even if they do hate the West. This is one of Russia's fundamental problems with this war. A lot of Russians have become skeptical over their country's leadership and the expensive shenanigans it gets up to, and widespread public skepticism is never a good thing for a war effort. Sure, Putin's approval rating has gone from 67% to 77% over the last year, but as more body bags containing sons return to their mothers, we might see more support for the West and less support for the perfidious Putin. The US and Putin know very well what happens when a country stretches itself too thin where cash is involved. With the Ukraine situation, the US and UK might just be biding their time while bringing economically struggling Russia to its already scuffed knees. This is partly the reason why the US has spent at least $54 billion on aid to Ukraine. It's why some Democratic and Republican politicians want to spend much more. Money matters a lot in this war, and Ukraine has no shortage of very rich countries happy to bankroll the excessively pricey conflict. The numbers keep changing, but some sources say the US has already spent about $25 billion in military aid alone, with the rest being humanitarian aid and other kinds of help. The UK comes next with a military-only aid package of just over $4 billion. Next is Poland, $1.8 billion, then Germany at $1.2 billion, and Canada at $1.03 billion. As we said, the numbers are changing all the time since new packages keep getting approved. For instance, bipartisan legislators in the US recently introduced a bill to give the Pentagon emergency powers to sell as many weapons as it wants to Ukraine. The 50-odd countries that are sending aid to Ukraine are collectively spending over $100 billion, although it should be said that some countries are sending warm gloves and toothbrushes, while others are sending very expensive modern weapons. Meanwhile, Russia's military aid from around the globe adds up to something close to the value of a brass button. Russia isn't getting financial aid, although it's said Belarus is offering non-economic aid, and there are tens of thousands of mercenaries fighting for Russia. Still, judging economic aid for Russia and Ukraine is like comparing Mount Everest to a mouse. As for China, the alliance of the US with some Asian nations might be enough to make China concerned, but so far it hasn't openly offered support for Russia's war effort. Even those who say the conflict is a US proxy war have condemned Russia. We're trying to say that Russia isn't going to get any considerable help anytime soon, and help for Ukraine is seemingly bottomless. Right now, things are looking like one of those us versus rest of the world soccer matches. It's like the old movie Escape to Victory, when the evil Nazi guards and the mixed nationality POW guys played a soccer game. Guess who wins? So one of Russia's biggest problems is the fact that it's fighting a war alone against a country that's supported on almost a global scale. This cannot be underestimated. Sure, the US and the UK aren't officially sending soldiers to fight on the front lines, even if some of the citizens in those countries would like that. Instead, what they're sending in aid is indispensable to Ukraine's war effort. In June, it was reported that the UK just sent over 6,500 shoulder-mounted anti-air armor weapons and Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. It sent hundreds of millions of dollars of what the press just called lethal weapons. Some of the packages included M109 howitzers, anti-tank weapons, multiple launch rocket systems, and hundreds of air defense missiles. As for the US, it's raining lethal weapons down on Ukraine, reminiscent of a biblical flood. It's like a supermarket sweep for Ukraine, but with weapons instead of groceries. The US has also sent scores of Javelin anti-tank missiles, as well as billions of dollars in Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, helicopters, counter-artillery, Humvees, electronic warfare detection systems, M777 howitzers, armored personnel carriers, light anti-armor weapons, AT-4 anti-armor systems, and the list goes on and on. You might be wondering how this has affected Russia's war effort. The answer is in a big way. If you've been following what's going on, you'll know that the Ukraine advance later in the year pushed the Russians out of the strongholds. Towns are liberated, only for the liberators to find mass graves, and what the Western media referred to as a giant scrap heap of Russian tanks. You'll notice in the list of lethal weapons we just talked about, many of the tools the West provided can be very effective at taking out tanks. After the Russians had retreated from those strongholds, after months of being there and wreaking havoc on locals, masses of tanks were left, sometimes with the burned bodies of young Russian soldiers inside them. In part thanks to all that aid, Ukraine has been kicking the living daylights out of Russian tanks. And we aren't just talking about the older tanks, the T-62s and T-72s, but some of the newer T-90s. Russia has always been a leading nation when it came to tank tech, but right now, its tank strategy sucks. So let's just say for now that many young Russian soldiers are not too keen on getting into one of those tanks. The chances of being incinerated are high, all for a war they might not properly understand and don't want to be a part of. If Ukraine wasn't being helped, the conflict would turn out very differently. You already know Ukraine doesn't have a massive military budget. It has only 200,000 active personnel compared to Russia's 850,000 active personnel. Ukraine only has about 2,500 tanks of its own, although it has lost some recently too. Russia has about 12,000 tanks, even though it's been losing about 10 a day since Ukraine advanced. So make no mistake, all that aid is considerably helping Ukraine. But the problem for Russia isn't just about machines. Its tactics have been less than brilliant. Its support of troops has been lacking at times. For instance, Russian tanks should have the requisite modern armor to defend themselves, but that's often not what happened. Russian tank crews have complained that they've been ordered to advance at times when there hasn't been adequate reconnaissance. That is insane. But worse, the tanks are often out in the open, not moving with sufficient infantry and artillery. You don't have to be a military genius to know that shouldn't happen. Even after playing your first game of Risk, you'll understand that. When these tanks are left so vulnerable, all those Ukrainian anti-tank weapons do their worst. At times, Russian tanks have been sitting ducks when fired upon from close range by all those javelins and new generation light anti-tank weapons that the UK and the US have been so kind to send over. As the BBC reported, US-supplied anti-tank weapons have been among the most effective weapons in Ukraine's arsenal. Since these weapons aim for the top of the tanks where they're the weakest, they result in something called pop-tops. That means when the turret is blown off, it almost always means the 3 men inside die. It's an awful way to go, we expect. So how do you think Russian soldiers feel about this? The Russians have lost tanks en masse, maybe about 2,500, and a good portion of them have been abandoned. Their crews just got out and ran for their lives. Some soldiers have said they'll never return to the front line. What they saw there was a strategic blunder after strategic blunder. They felt way too vulnerable, as though they were being sent to their deaths. It wasn't a fight at all, it was an annihilation. One of the Russian soldiers later said, "We were like blind kittens. I'm shocked by our army. It wouldn't cost much to equip us." Some of the tanks didn't have proper armor. Tanks should have explosive reactive armor or active armor, but reports state that some Russian tank crews had taken to covering their turrets with wood or with iron cages they'd found. They were doing tank DIY, which might sound funny if you've never heard the screams of your friends being burned alive. Remember we talked about Russia being financially stretched? Is that affecting how well these tanks are performing? Analysts have been scratching their heads at the heavy losses of Russian tanks. They say those tanks should have the right armor to protect against these types of attacks, and even though anti-tank weapons can still be catastrophic to an armored machine, they shouldn't have been going down as fast as they have. Analysts have said it's been a problem with maintenance of the armor, or perhaps the absence of armor, or the tank crews not being trained in ERA systems. Experts are saying that Russian tank armor is proving to be about 8 times less effective than the tank armor that NATO uses. This could be a matter of money, lack of expertise, a lack of good leadership, or all those things combined. This dubious doctrine has often led to tanks grouping together, forming a great big sitting duck traffic jam. At times, the tank crews have been moving without any support, and when they have support, it's often from guys who are flipping burgers or fixing someone's plumbing not a few weeks earlier. Low morale is the reason many Russians don't want to fight. It's why some have abandoned their tanks or their posts pretty quickly. One Russian soldier said he was among 78 guys in his brigade that refused orders and said they would fight no more. He told a journalist, "I'm morally exhausted. There's absolutely no trust in the authorities and the higher command. I'm tired, homesick. My daughter was born 3 months ago." Another said, "I thought a long time about it and came to the decision. I understood that I had to refuse so I could stay alive." There are so many reports saying the same things. And let's not forget that due to the retreat of Russian troops, when Ukraine advanced and took back thousands of square miles from the Russians, what was left behind was often something of military value. Ukrainian ammo, for instance, can often be used with captured Russian tanks. There's also the question of centralization. Chechens have been fighting for the Russian army, as has the National Guard, as have soldiers hired by private contractors, plus mercenaries, and with this comes the fact that they're fighting without a centralized structure. An analyst said this about that: "There are multiple strands of the Russian army with their own agendas, tactics, and reasons for fighting. There have been reports of Russian draft officers approaching guys in the streets and signing them up for fighting, what the press called aggressive recruitment. One guy said he worked in IT and should have been exempted from the draft, but to his utter astonishment, he later found himself saying farewell to his wife and 4-year-old kid and heading to the front. He did not want to fight. He did not know how to fight. Men like him have been getting just 5 to 10 days of basic training and a further 5 to 15 days of unit training, and then they're packed off to the battlefield. To say this is not good would be as obvious as saying you should not enter your cat into a swimming competition with dogs. You guys and girls watching this who are old enough for a military draft, how do you think you'd fare in that amount of training? How do you think you deal with hearing your buddies being incinerated in a tank by weapons you know have been sent to your enemy by numerous nations? Do you think you could cope? Many Russians can't, and that's why there are reports coming in from all over about Russian men taking devastating and drastic actions to not fight. We can't say what they did exactly, but we imagine you can guess. As for Alexei, as you know, he had just a few days of training. He went to the front line without knowing the first thing about combat. If you asked him about land warfare strategy or tank armor, he might have looked at you like you'd asked him what he thinks about string theory. Russia has not been very open about sending guys like Alexei into the bloody battle. A journalist for RT said this was plain wrong. She wrote, "Military leaders, now is not the time to lie. You have no right to lie, and now it is a crime." Alexei's father simply said, "My son has died. What am I for?" This kind of outside criticism is not good for the Russian war effort. It should be said that Alexei wasn't forced to fight. He just did what was asked of him. A Russian lawyer familiar with the case said he didn't try to get out of his service. He gathered his things together and he went. He acted bravely. He was brave, for sure. But if you were able to go back in time and ask that drunkard of a philosopher Socrates what he thought about this, he'd tell you that there's a fine line between bravery and ignorance. Alexei and other men like him shouldn't be fighting in a war after so little training. Russia is not Sparta. Most men know nothing about mortal combat. As has happened in the history around the world, Russia has offered some prisoners early release or immediate release if they fight. But are prisoners your best option? Often men become prisoners from a lack of self-control. Perhaps a childhood of trauma has led to their frontal lobes not kicking in when they get mad. This is the last thing you want in a war. History tells us convicts don't usually make the best soldiers. You don't want lunatics fighting for you. Anyway, some prisoners might not be too fond of the state that locked them up. Do you think they'd risk their lives for it? And if some rather violent psychopaths ended up in control of Ukrainian towns and their citizens, what do you think they might do with total impunity to kill? Psychos don't win wars. All-out enraged assaults don't win fights. Strategy and emotional control do. Not only that, but many of the best trained men are dead, and they'll be hard to replace. In September, the BBC reported that 1,000 Russian officers had succumbed. It was BBC Russia, so we had to translate, but here's how the article started. The BBC, based on open sources, managed to identify more than 6,020 Russian soldiers who died in the war in Ukraine. Particularly sensitive losses were suffered by Special Forces units as well as junior officers. It will not be easy to make up for their lack in a Russian army. Russia's soldiers, the ones properly trained with combat experience, are educated in what Russia is an expert at. That is short-lasting, hyper-intensive combat. The Russian military was virtually designed for this, and this war is anything but that. While Ukraine has been getting ready for long-term warfare for close to a decade, Russia might well be playing the long game here, but there's no doubt that it has done badly recently, and morale for the most part is about as high as Hades after an earthquake. Nonetheless, as bad as things have looked as of late, Russia is still a military powerhouse for a reason. It's made some mistakes, sure. Some of its troops have watched them and are not impressed, but by the time this show comes out, maybe Russia will have improved matters. Despite these losses, we should not underestimate the Russian military. This pretty much contradicts what you've heard today, but the failures of the Russian military we've discussed have happened. The support we've told you Ukraine has is very much real. Okay, so what's behind Russia's underperformance besides what we've discussed? The same analyst we just quoted said Russia's massive weapons arsenal is from several generations, and that might make it quite inflexible. The more losses Russia faces, the more equipment comes out of storage warehouses, and so on the whole you have more technical inflexibility. When you add it all up, and we haven't even gone into the corruption in the Russian military and the present lack of exceptional leadership, things are not looking good for Russia. The number of young folks that are willing to fight is getting smaller, and the number of troops in the field is diminishing. They are outnumbered and outmoraled. We know that's not a word. The public might soon turn on Putin, especially when military spending increases. We just hope when the last straw that breaks the camel's back is dropped, no one makes a grab for the nuclear launch codes. Things in the southern region of Ukraine are about to go from bad to worse. Vladimir Putin has just declared martial law in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. This likely is a desperate attempt to maintain control in the regions, but also has a much darker and sinister purpose. What is happening in these Ukrainian states is reminiscent of Nazi Germany, as Putin is literally trying to change the ethnic makeup of the region. Let's examine what martial law is, why Putin has implemented it in illegally annexed parts of Ukraine, and what it could mean for the future. However, before we dive in, imagine this haunting scenario. Overnight, your freedom is completely revoked. You can't leave your house without permission, and you have to support an enemy in their war efforts. Every day is a worse nightmare than the last. You step outside of your house. The streets are desolate as the sun begins to set over the distant hills. With everything that's been going on, you forgot to buy bread this morning, and without it, your family will starve. You look down the street to make sure no one's there and run down an alleyway. On the other side of the street is your local bakery. You dart out onto the main road where you hear a voice scream, "Halt!" You freeze, knowing that if you take another step, you could be shot. 3 Russian soldiers walk up to you, rifles slung across their shoulders. "What are you doing out after curfew?" One of the soldiers asks. You explain that you forgot to buy bread and your family's starving. The soldier just laughs. They have no sympathy. Well, if you're headed to the bakery, you must have money on you. And all money should be going to pay the soldiers who are fighting for your freedom, like us. You stare at the soldier with pleading eyes. You ask them to show mercy, as you have 2 little kids and a wife at home. They just continue to laugh. One of the soldiers grabs your arms and holds them behind your back. Another searches your pockets and finds your wallet. They take the money out of it, throw the wallet to the ground, and just for good measure, punch you in the stomach. "Now go back home and don't let us find you out after curfew again," the Russian soldier says before spitting on you. The soldiers walk away laughing. This is what your country has turned into since Russia invaded. And now that martial law is in place, the military can do anything they want. This is the current reality in parts of southern Ukraine. But what exactly is martial law, and what does it allow Putin to do? If we think back to several months ago when the war had just started, the goals of Vladimir Putin were vague at best and the ravings of a lunatic at worst. Just to recap how we got to where we are today, Putin proclaimed he wanted to reestablish a former Russian empire. He spewed lies and propaganda, stating that southern Ukraine had been stolen from Russia and that the citizens living there wanted to be reincorporated back to the motherland. Some people living in Ukraine did want this, but the vast majority enjoyed the independence and freedom from the oppressive regime of Russia and the democratic nature of the government. This brings us to the real reasons why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Yes, he wanted to form a new Russian empire. However, it was the democratic nature of Ukraine and the country becoming more westernized that actually led Putin to invade. He knew that if Ukraine became part of the European Union, NATO, or allied itself with the West, it could threaten his rule in Russia. Paranoia is a common trait among ruthless dictators because if citizens realized that their lives could be better if they had a say in the government and then decided to start a revolution, dictators tend to lose their lives. Putin probably always has this thought in the back of his mind, and as Ukraine became more and more westernized, Putin felt that he had to attack to save himself. It's not entirely clear which former Russian empire Putin wants to reestablish, however. When the former Soviet Union collapsed, Russia lost a lot of territory in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. However, if Putin is hoping to reform the Tsarist Empire of 1914, then there would be a lot more conflict in the future. It's important to remember that the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions were illegally annexed by Russia. In September, a staged referendum was conducted where voters were met at the polls by armed Russian soldiers who held them at gunpoint until they voted for their states to be annexed by Russia. That's right, the Ukrainian people living in the annexed regions of Ukraine were given a choice to vote for their homeland to be incorporated into Russia or die. There's little doubt that many Ukrainians were killed during the referendum for refusing to vote for annexation. The United Nations and the majority of the world do not recognize Russia's authority in these regions. However, this doesn't matter to Putin. Russia has occupied southern Ukraine for several months now, so the question becomes, why did Putin declare martial law now? Like many of Vlad's decisions, this one doesn't seem to be completely thought out. Martial law expands the power of the military and law enforcement agents in the region. Occupied Ukraine really didn't have much freedom to begin with. All Putin is doing by declaring martial law is giving a different name to what's already been happening. Under the umbrella of martial law, the military can impose curfews, restrict freedoms, take civilian property, enlist people into the army, and force residents to rebuild any destroyed infrastructure. Again, these things are already happening in the occupied territories. However, since Moscow hasn't declared martial law since the Soviet Union, this may be Putin's first official move to bring annexed parts of Ukraine into his Russian empire. But again, the question is, why now? What does Putin get out of declaring martial law? Putin has not just initiated martial law in Ukraine, but in the rest of Russia as well. However, there are different tiers of martial law depending on where you live. In Russia, Putin has called for basic martial law, which means nothing is really going to change, but citizens should be prepared to aid the military in its war effort by working in factories or enlisting in the army if asked. In southern Ukraine, the martial law is instated and labeled as maximum readiness, which means that the people in those regions will be asked to make sacrifices immediately to help Russia fight against the rest of Ukraine. Putin has continually said that the reason he needed to implement martial law is that Ukraine's government and its Western allies refused to accept the result of the annexation referendum as legitimate, which of course they weren't. Putin declared in one speech, "As is well known, the regime in Kyiv has refused to recognize the will of the people. We are trying to resolve difficult, large-scale challenges on providing security to Russia and protecting the future of Russia, defending our people." What it really comes down to is that Russia has suffered a number of significant defeats in the war against Ukraine. Most recently, this has happened in the battle to control Lyman, where Ukrainian forces humiliated the Russian military by holding their ground and forcing the Russian army into full retreat. It's also important to note that Ukraine still controls parts of Donbas, where Putin has declared martial law, which means that the citizens living under Russian military control will be asked to not only support Russia, but fight alongside them as well. Putin needed to declare martial law so that the military had the authority to use citizens as resources of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia however they deemed fit to defeat Ukrainian forces. Many Ukrainians have fled the Russian-occupied regions in the south. However, not everyone was so lucky. Martial law will give the Russian military the authority to compel any civilian under their control to aid the Russian war effort, which is a breach of the Geneva Convention. But Vladimir Putin has no concern over the proper conduct of war or basic human rights, so he's more than happy to formally increase his military's authority in southern Ukraine to allow them to use Ukrainian citizens however they see fit. The crazy thing is that by instituting martial law, Putin may be trying to mobilize a Ukrainian-style territorial defense force made up of Russian officers and part-time reservists, which would be supplemented by civilians. The martial law also allows the military to have greater control over who comes in and out of each region. There's currently a 7-day ban on civilians entering any of the annexed regions. However, since Russia doesn't control all of the territory in the 4 regions, this ban on movement will be extremely hard to enforce. The martial law declared by Putin also has a propaganda component to it. By stating he has the authority to modify the way things are being run in southern Ukraine, he is reinforcing the false fact that there were elections in the region and that the people living in the region are now happily a part of Russia. The decisions that Putin is making are all part of the narrative that he's just trying to do what's best for the Russian people. However, the rest of the world isn't falling for it, and it seems that Russian citizens might be losing faith in old Vladi and his regime. The implementation of martial law will likely be used to secure more resources for Russia. One main aspect of martial law is that the military can now repurpose any business or manufacturing center that they need. For example, metalworking factories that once produced materials for infrastructure can be repurposed into building weapons and war vehicles. Companies that procure natural resources such as fossil fuels or minerals can be forced to give their supply directly to the military. Basically, martial law allows the Russian government to convert any and all parts of its economy into a war machine. However, the most atrocious part of the martial law implemented by Putin is it will allow for easier deportation of certain populations out of Ukraine and into Russia. This is where things get a little too close to how Nazi Germany acted in World War II. It's no secret that Putin wants to enact mass deportation of certain Ukrainian populations to parts of Russia. The reason he wants to do this is to change the ethnic majority in the region. In Putin's eyes, Ukraine and much of Eastern Europe should still be part of the Russian Empire. By deporting problematic people who claim to have a culture separate from Russia's, Putin can create a more homogeneous state that's made up of people who are loyal to him. Putin's regime has claimed they're only using force to temporarily resettle people. However, the fact that certain people are being targeted for deportation strongly suggests there is a much more sinister agenda at work. Experts estimate that somewhere between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainians have been deported from their homeland into Russia. It's not entirely clear where these people are being sent or what they're being forced to do, but there's a chance they're being put in camps where they're required to aid the Russian military by working in factories or dangerous mining operations. Obviously, this looks really bad for Putin and his regime, so they released a statement shortly before announcing that martial law would be coming, saying that the residents were free to evacuate from southern Ukraine and the government would not only help them relocate in any part of Russia, but would provide housing vouchers as well. This was a thinly veiled distraction from what was about to happen. Every free-thinking individual knew it was just more propaganda to make Putin look sympathetic, as his military forced people onto transports and sent them deep into Russia. Martial law also allows Putin to send more troops to annexed regions of Ukraine without admitting he is losing the war. The Russian people are becoming more and more disheartened. Those who believe in the cause are starting to wane. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled the country to make sure they're not conscripted into the military. Putin is losing the support of his own people. However, by declaring martial law, he can ensure that the military keeps Russian citizens in line while also giving him a reason to send more troops to Ukraine. For propaganda purposes, Putin says that martial law will help ensure the ideals of Russia are being upheld in the annexed regions. But the more likely reason why Putin needs more troops in Ukraine is he's afraid he'll lose the war. This also answers the question of why now. Russian forces have been defeated and pushed back several times in recent months. A war that was only supposed to last a month or two is quickly approaching a year. Putin will never admit it, but in the back of his mind, he is likely scared. If Russia loses the war in Ukraine, or if the war gets drawn out for much longer, the people of Russia will see Vladimir Putin as being weak. There's a good chance if this happens, he'll be overthrown and executed by his own citizens. Therefore, Putin must maintain as much control and influence as possible. He's doing this by using his military and giving them more power through martial law. This will force businesses and defense contractors to align with his goals and provide him with the soldiers and resources necessary to continue fighting in Ukraine. It'll also allow Putin to not only control the populations in the annexed regions more easily, but will also allow him to control his citizens at home, especially if they start to become unruly or try to start a revolution against him. Putin and the rest of his regime believe that enacting martial law across Russia and southern Ukraine is a show of strength. However, many think it indicates how desperate they've become. The fact that Vladimir Putin needs to position his military in a way that ensures his citizens will continue to support him in his war effort is a telling sign that things are going very badly for him. The desperate tactics are less strategic and more of an indication that Putin and his allies are losing control. The sad part is that martial law will likely cause more death and despair in occupied Ukraine. As Putin becomes more desperate, he'll continue to escalate his tactics to ensure he remains in power and the war can continue on. However, if Putin ever loses control or Russia is defeated, it will not only be the end of Putin's reign, but likely his life as well. Ukraine has been asking for heavy combat vehicles since the start of the invasion, and it seems as if its wish is about to come true. Western tanks could spell disaster for Putin's invasion, which is why he's worked so hard to scare the West into not sending them. At the start of the invasion, Ukraine had around 2,500 armored vehicles, all of which were Soviet-era models. Generally outclassed by Russian equipment, Ukrainian equipment was on the whole older and less capable, putting them at a serious disadvantage. However, an influx of hundreds of Western anti-tank missiles and the defensive nature of the initial invasion helped to move the loss ratio firmly into Ukraine's favor, with Russia taking significantly more losses per combat engagement. Still, as a percentage of their total fleet, Ukraine was suffering catastrophic losses, with some figures estimating that Ukraine has had nearly 100% of its starting fleet of vehicles destroyed, damaged, or captured. Many of these would end up being repaired, but an even greater boon to Ukraine was the hordes of vehicles left behind by retreating Russians. In short order, Russia quickly became the largest donor of military aid to Ukraine, which is a terrible way of winning a war. However, Ukraine is only capable of manufacturing small numbers of domestic armored vehicles due to its small arms industry and the fact that a lot of it's been destroyed in the war. The small number of defense plants in Ukraine were a top priority target for Russia, which on most days can't hit the broadside of a barn from 10 feet away. But when you have as many missiles as Russia originally had going into the war, odds are you're eventually going to hit what you're aiming at. The taking of important industrial cities in the east also seriously hampered Ukrainian manufacturing, as generally speaking, the east is Ukraine's industrial sector and the west is mainly used for farming. Unless they figure out how to make tanks out of wheat and barley, Ukraine would inevitably be in serious trouble, and no number of anti-tank missiles from the west could stop that. Anti-tank missiles, after all, can't defeat entrenched infantry nor take and hold ground. At the start of the war, most of the West believed the Russian hype and was sure that Ukraine would fall within days, weeks at most. This is why it's unfair to criticize the West for not moving faster to provide aid for the nation. It makes no sense to send equipment to an army in a fight it's inevitably going to quickly lose. At the start of the war, the West's strategy was to make the Russian army suffer as badly as it could in its invasion, not believing it could be truly stopped. Man-portable anti-tank missiles and air defense systems accomplished this with great success, taking a massive toll on Russia's armored forces and decimating as much as a quarter of its attack helicopter fleet. The combat environment became so deadly for Russian helicopters that even today the mighty Ka-52, a truly capable and fearsome attack chopper, is only good as an inaccurate aerial artillery platform, forced to launch volleys of rockets in a pitch-up maneuver well outside of the range of enemy manpads. However, as the Kyiv offensive stalled out and then ended in a total retreat, the world realized Ukraine could actually win this thing, or at least it could hold out long enough and inflict enough pain on Russia that the nation would be forced to settle for a very limited victory. The request for heavy combat systems was finally being answered, though with disappointing results. Instead of the battle tanks Ukraine was asking for, the US sent the antiquated M113 battle taxis and Humvees. European nations largely followed suit, mostly sending artillery and some air defense equipment. The West had entered a self-deterrent Ouroboros cycle, intimidated by Putin's nuclear rhetoric, and this was exactly Putin's goal from the start and why he made so many TV appearances talking around the possibility of using nuclear weapons without ever confirming nor denying that he would use them in the Ukrainian conflict. Western leaders collectively browned their pants at the thought of Putin going nuclear, and now every single proposed shipment of Western equipment was put under extreme scrutiny by the entire NATO alliance. When the US provided HIMARS, some EU leaders thought it entirely too provocative, which is why it initially only sent a dozen or so of the weapon system. This long-range artillery, however, proved to immediately be incredibly effective, prompting the US to send more. And yet, HIMARS' effectiveness worked against Ukraine's wishes for more of the platform, as well as serious hardware like Western tanks. The mobile 6-missile rocket artillery was able to deliver precision firepower that devastated Russian logistics and command and control networks, killing many senior Russian officials. Its high mobility then allowed it to escape Russian artillery reprisals and attack helicopters hunting them down. The use of cheap plywood decoys led to Russia claiming to have destroyed approximately 300% more HIMARS than the US had actually sent. All this was putting Russia in a very bad position, exploited to great effect by the September counterattack that retook massive swaths of the east. Putin once more amped up the rhetoric, and in return, the West once more browned its collective pantalones as news anchors moaned about escalation in nightly broadcasts. This ensured that there would be no chance of Ukraine getting the tanks it so desperately needed and wanted. Ukraine simply couldn't win too hard against Russia because it was hurting Putin's feelings. What the escalation narrative fails to take into account, however, is that Putin has already escalated multiple times in his war against Ukraine. More to the point, Putin's nuclear rhetoric is exactly that: tough-talking, saber-rattling meant to scare Westerners, when in reality even Putin isn't stupid enough to turn this losing war nuclear. The US has already promised catastrophic conventional consequences, and unlike Russia, its military actually, well, works. Plus, in order to have any real effect on the war, Putin would either have to use strategic nuclear weapons against major population centers or dozens of tactical weapons against troop formations. Either move would turn Russia into a global pariah, completely cutting it off from the global community and destroying it economically and politically. The West is finally sacking up, though, and we have Britain to thank for that. For the last few months, it's been extremely clear that the West needed to act extremely soon if it didn't want to see Ukraine's gains in September completely reversed in the coming spring. This is because Russia might have suffered truly apocalyptic losses in men and equipment, but its stockpiles of both are very deep. It might not be bringing the best gear to the fight by a long shot, but it's bringing a lot of it. And Ukraine's losses are no longer being replenished by captured Russian vehicles. In short, the West needs to act immediately if it wants to have Ukraine tank crews trained and prepared for the spring fight. Poland, probably because it's the closest to the fighting and historically has been savaged by foreign invaders, was quick to offer up its Leopard 2s to Ukraine, but it needed permission from Germany. As the Leopard 2 is manufactured in Germany and exported under license, Poland would need to secure permission to send the tanks to Ukraine as a term of its purchase agreement with Germany, but also to ensure the flow of replacement parts for repairs and maintenance. However, Germany was hesitant, much as the rest of the West, as no nation wanted to take the lead in providing heavy equipment and being blamed for any potential, quote, escalation. In effect, while Putin was bleeding the Ukrainians dry, Western leaders were standing at the edge of the pool, anxiously daring each other to be the first to jump in. Finally, Britain said, "Hold my tea," and stolen cultural artifacts, and plunged in feet first, offering up an entire squadron, or 14 of its Challenger 2 tanks. The move immediately sparked a wave of outcry and whining from the Kremlin, with Russian Federation spokesman Dmitry Peskov promising that Britain's Challenger 2s would burn just like the rest. Good luck with that, bro, because now Russian tankers operating mostly Cold War T-72s will be facing one of the best, if not the best, armored main battle tank in the world. The Challenger 2 is legendary for its ability to take punishment, a design feature that came about because of Britain deciding that the best way to win a tank fight was simply out-survive everyone else on the battlefield and going heavy on the defense. Now it appears as if the floodgates are slowly creaking open, with Germany under extreme pressure to allow the export of NATO Leopard 2s to Ukraine. The vehicle is absolutely critical for Ukraine and the only realistic option to supply the nation with heavy tanks. The reason why is because of logistics. There are approximately 2,000 Leopard 2s across Europe in the various armies of the EU's militaries. The US has a comparable number of Abrams tanks and could certainly afford to send a significant number, given that the only real conflict the US faces, war with China, would see extremely little, if any, ground combat. However, unless the US digs into prepositioned stocks, it would have to ship Abrams tanks all the way from the US to Europe, and even if it sends from its prepositioned stocks, like it has with 50 Bradley IFVs it recently sent to Ukraine, it still faces the task of providing logistical support on the battlefield from an entire ocean and half a continent away. The Abrams is a notorious maintenance-heavy monster, and that's no surprise given it's one of the most advanced tanks in the world. But like most American equipment, it's a total prima donna, and only the world's richest nation can actually afford to operate it in large numbers. Which is why the Leopard 2 is integral to Ukraine. Logistics networks are local, allowing for much faster, cheaper, and easier resupply and maintenance for Ukrainian vehicles. Tanks damaged in battle could easily be removed and shipped across the border to Poland, where they could be fixed and then sent back to the battle in a matter of weeks. This is something that without significant investment in logistics networks, the US simply could not do with the Abrams. Simply put, the time to start prepping and sending the Abrams was when the war started, not when Ukraine needs tanks on the front lines in 2 to 3 months. Western tanks, whether they end up being more Challengers, Leopards, or even American Abrams, are a nightmare for Putin and his forces. Currently, Russia is replacing its destroyed T-90s, albeit extremely slowly. This means that the bulk of its armored forces consist of Cold War-era T-80s and T-72s. And most of the more modern versions of these have already been destroyed or graciously donated to Ukraine by retreating Russians running for their lives. This leaves Russian tankers facing the prospect of having to go toe-to-toe with semi-modern Western tanks, and we've already seen this movie back in the early 90s during the First Gulf War. The comparison is actually incredibly apt, because the West is unlikely to send its most modern variants and instead send Leopard 2s upgraded to around the early 2000 levels at the most. But even if it sends its absolutely oldest models, Western tanks already proved their worth against their Soviet equivalents, with kill ratios between the two sides being best described as hilariously one-sided. The most likely variant to be sent to Ukraine is the Leopard 2A4, the most widespread version of the tank. This model began production in 1985 and ceased by 1992, with all previous versions updated to this standard. Featuring a digital fire control system and upgrades to its armor, the 2A4 is definitely dated, but likely to fare far better than its Russian counterparts as the nation is forced to dig deeper and deeper into its reserve stockpiles. Whatever tank the West decides to send to Ukraine, however, it needs to decide to do it immediately. As spring nears, a new massive Russian offensive is expected, and Ukraine's stocks of armored vehicles are already running dangerously low. More to the point, Ukraine is fighting a war against Russia on behalf of the rest of the world, and a further dithering on the West's behalf, here's looking at you, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is doing nothing but costing Ukrainian lives, both civilian and military. Mercenaries fire upon innocent civilians. These hired killers have been sent around the world to create mayhem and protect Russian interests. According to Putin and his government, the Wagner Group does not officially exist. Yet it has become abundantly clear that the organization has extremely close ties to the Russian president and sometimes acts as his own private army. The Wagner Group has been known to use terror tactics, torture, and brutality to carry out their missions. However, they're not always successful. And when they fail, the Wagner Group tends to leave behind even more carnage than when they succeed. Let's take a look at this dark group of mercenaries and find out how Putin uses them to do his bidding. The Wagner Group has no official registration of business, tax records, or formal governing body. This is because Putin wants plausible deniability for all the organization's actions. Technically, the Wagner Group shouldn't exist as it's illegal for private military companies to operate in Russia. However, this hasn't stopped the Wagner Group from buying property, setting up training facilities, and advertising recruitment opportunities on billboards across Russia. So what is actually going on with this mysterious and deadly group? We're going to take you down the rabbit hole that is the Wagner Group, so hold on tight and be ready for a bumpy ride. Throughout this journey, keep in mind that someone is always behind the scenes pulling the strings. This might just be a powerful individual who remains shrouded in mystery, but more likely than not, Vladimir Putin has a hand in everything that the Wagner Group does. It's likely that the organization was started a little before 2014, but not much of its establishment is actually known. There are conflicting reports on who started the Wagner Group, but some believe it might have been Dmitry Utkin, a former GRU soldier who served in the Chechen Wars and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. In 2013, Utkin left the Russian military and joined the Moran Security Group, which is a private military company that operates internationally, including in Russia. He soon left this organization and allegedly founded the Wagner Group. Many have theorized that the Wagner Group was named after Dmitry Utkin's call sign in the Russian military, which was Wagner. Others claim that Wagner came from the German classical composer Richard Wagner, who just happened to be one of Adolf Hitler's favorites. Some have theorized the connection between the Third Reich and the Wagner Group comes from the numerous neo-Nazis and white supremacists that are a part of the organization. It also has been reported that Dmitry Utkin himself has several Nazi tattoos. But what if Dmitry Utkin is just a figurehead to divert attention away from the real founder of the company? It appears this might have been the case, as a much more powerful entity has been pulling the strings behind the scenes for almost a decade. Vladimir Putin is almost certainly not the founder of the Wagner Group, but someone who has become very close to him might be. A Russian businessman named Yevgeny Prigozhin recently came out and said he founded the Wagner Group and was in charge of the organization. A while ago, Prigozhin was given the name Putin's chef by the media as he hosted dinners for the Russian president along with other foreign dignitaries. From 2014 all the way up until last year, Prigozhin continuously denied he had any connection to the Wagner Group, yet in September of 2022, Prigozhin changed his tone when he stated, "I cleaned up the old weapons myself, sorted out the bulletproof vests myself, and found specialists who could help me with this." From that moment, on May 1st, 2014, a group of patriots was born, which later came to be called the Wagner Battalion. Perhaps this is just the ravings of a lunatic who wants power, but there seems to be some truth behind his words. Yevgeny Prigozhin spent the initial years after the Soviet Union fell in jail for theft. After he got out, not much is known of where he went or what he did, but it appears he started rubbing elbows with some powerful people from Moscow to position himself closer to Putin. His ambitions were twofold. The first thing he got out of starting the Wagner Group was loads of money from the Russian government and through other parties who needed to hire mercenaries or private security. The second perk was that by providing his services to Putin, he set himself up to join the Kremlin's inner circle and perhaps even secure a position in politics in the future. If Prigozhin has been controlling the Wagner Group since 2014, his main goal for the past several years has been clear: to make money. However, he could only do this with Putin's blessing, as without the dictator backing the organization, the Wagner Group couldn't exist in Russia due to the country's laws. This is likely why Prigozhin wined and dined Putin until an agreement could be formed. Then there's the theory that the Wagner Group isn't a private entity at all, but is actually run as a branch of the Russian military. The Kremlin could never admit to this, as they used the Wagner Group to carry out missions that they could not openly conduct themselves due to geopolitical ramifications. And even though the Wagner Group technically isn't supposed to exist, and Putin has said countless times that Russia has no ties to the mercenary group, their soldiers continuously show up time and again to carry out assignments that the regular Russian military just can't do. This is further supported by the fact that the Wagner Group almost always shares bases with Russian infantry, is transported by Russian military aircraft and vehicles, and uses the Russian military's healthcare system. On top of this, the Russian state has also provided Wagner Group members with Russian passports so they can travel within Russia freely and to countries where Putin needs his dirty work done more freely. The question then becomes, if Putin didn't have connections to the Wagner Group, why then are its members given such preferential treatment? This answer is obvious. Putin is connected to the Wagner Group, and they do whatever he tells them to do without asking any questions. This gives the president of Russia plausible deniability when things go sideways, or Wagner members commit crimes against humanity, which they tend to do fairly often. Even if the organization is run by Prigozhin or anyone other than Putin, the leader of Russia has the group in his back pocket, and they will eagerly do anything he asks of them. Before we go into the insane things the Wagner Group has done, such as assassinations, torture, and civilian massacres, let's discuss what else we know about the group. In 2016, the Wagner Group consisted of around 1,000 mercenaries. This number increased to 6,000 by 2017. This indicates that whatever recruitment tactics the organization was using worked, and that the pay being offered was higher than what these men would receive fighting in a regular army. During this time, the Wagner Group had offices in different parts of Russia, Argentina, and Hong Kong. In 2022, they opened their brand new headquarters in East St. Petersburg. For a private military group that is not supposed to legally exist in Russia, they had a clear presence that no one was questioning. Reports and interviews suggest that the Wagner Group trains its mercenaries at Russian MOD facilities near a remote village called Molkin Krasnodar Krai. Russia denies that the base has any ties to its military and that the structures located in the town are only part of a children's vacation camp. The mercenaries trained here are all from different parts of the world, although the majority are retired Russian servicemen between the ages of 35 and 55. These hired soldiers are paid somewhere between 80,000 and 250,000 Russian rubles a month, or about 650 to 2,000 US dollars. This is much more than they'd ever make as a part of the regular Russian military. While in training, new Wagner members are not allowed to use social media, the internet, or cell phones. This is most likely to keep any of the organization's secrets from slipping out to the rest of the world. On top of that, operatives must follow the Wagner Code of Honor, which seems to be a list of commandments that must not be broken. One of the very first rules is to protect the interest of Russia always and everywhere, which gives a clear picture of where this private organization's loyalty actually lies. And even though these men are mercenaries, which means they are literally in it for the money, one of the other parts of the code states they will fight not for money, but from the principle of winning always and everywhere. So it appears the Wagner Group itself is not afraid to identify its close ties with the Russian Federation and its leader, but the Kremlin still denies they have any involvement with the group. We now have gotten to the part of the Wagner Group's story where their war crimes all started. The year was 2014. Vladimir Putin had his sights set on Crimea, which was only a taste of what was to come in the following decade when Russia invaded the rest of Ukraine. Reports started coming in from Crimea about a group of mercenaries among the ranks of Russian soldiers flooding into the region. At the time, no one had heard of the Wagner Group because this would be their first mission for Vladimir Putin. The men in unmarked uniforms were known as the Little Green Men. Somewhere around 1,000 Wagner Group mercenaries were deployed to Crimea, where they were led by Dmitry Utkin. During the invasion, communications between Utkin and Russian generals were intercepted, which made it clear the Russian military was commanding the mercenary group. This came as a little surprise, as it quickly became apparent the Wagner Group would be Putin's go-to organization when he needed questionable deeds done. This also indicated that right from the beginning, the Wagner Group was in Putin's pocket. Even if Utkin was their figurehead, he didn't really have any decision-making power. Later, the mercenaries would go on to help Russian-backed separatist forces in different parts of Ukraine wreak havoc across the country. For example, after the invasion of Crimea, the Wagner Group went to the Donbas region, where they helped the pro-Russian forces destabilize local governments, dismantle their security forces, and take control of ammunition and weapon stores. Once things calmed down slightly in the region, members of the Wagner Group were given explicit orders, most likely from Putin himself, to kill any Russian commander or soldier that seemed to develop a rebellious attitude. There are reports that one raid ended with mercenaries killing 10 people suspected of going against Putin's wishes, and that many more were slaughtered by Wagner Group forces as they cleansed Crimea and the Donbass of anyone they saw as being a threat to the Russian occupation. After the incidents in Crimea in 2014, the Wagner Group were sent out to protect and promote Russian interests worldwide. The group may claim they're for hire by any entity who wants to pay them, yet it always seems like wherever Wagner Group mercenaries go, there's some kind of connection with the Kremlin. So let's put this debate to rest once and for all. Putin and the leaders of Russia can deny their involvement with the Wagner Group all they want, but it's glaringly obvious that the organization is funded, controlled, and has allegiance to Vladimir Putin. In 2017, the Wagner Group was deployed to Syria to aid Russia in securing vital sources of oil. The mercenaries were flown to the region on Russian military transports, and their equipment was delivered to Syria by a fleet of Russian merchant ships. It's as if Vladimir Putin didn't even care if the Wagner Group activity could be connected to him anymore. At that time, the Kremlin had established a set of guidelines that stated companies who seized oil and gas wells in Syria got to maintain their mining rights as long as they were in control of the resource. This meant the Wagner Group could profit from every mining site they captured. This was good for the business and good for Russia, as much of the profits made from the seized oil and gas wells were to be funneled to Putin and his regime. The Wagner Group would keep some of the money to pay their mercenaries and supposedly make Yevgeny Prigozhin a rich man, but it's almost a certainty that the Russian government profited greatly from the Wagner Group's activity in Syria. It was also during the organization's activities in Syria that the world would get a taste of how ruthless the members of the Wagner Group were. They had most definitely committed crimes in Crimea and the Donbass, but video recordings surfaced from Syria of members of the group beating a man thought to be a captured Syrian soldier and then beheading him. This horrific act would only set the foundation for atrocities that the Wagner Group would commit around the world in the coming years. Around the same time as the occupation in Syria, the Wagner Group deployed some of its men to Sudan. The mercenaries were filmed training the Sudanese military to fight against enemy forces in South Sudan. The connection between the Kremlin and Sudan was not quite as obvious as the one in Syria, but as journalists dug deeper, it became clear why the Wagner Group was in the country. The mercenaries were sent there to protect gold, uranium, and diamond mines that Russian companies had a large stake in. It appeared the Sudanese government would allow Russia to continue to exploit their lands in return for helping defeat the South Sudan forces. In fact, one expert said the mercenaries were explicitly sent to Sudan to hammer out beneficial conditions for the Russian companies. It goes without saying that Putin benefits from the profits of any Russian company, as taxes and under-the-table bribes will always be collected by the Kremlin. After years of fighting, a coup broke out in Sudan in 2019. Russia supported the Transitional Military Council, which meant the Wagner Group likely aided them in their overthrowing of the former government. The TMC promised to uphold Russia's contracts pertaining to Sudan's defense, along with increasing their mining rights and control of the energy sector. Therefore, it came as no surprise that Putin, through the help of the Wagner Group and their mercenaries, aided the TMC into coming to power. Across the Atlantic, the Wagner Group was sent to Venezuela in 2019 as a security force during the presidential crisis. They were there to provide protection for one of the candidates, and when you look at the track record of each, it was pretty obvious who the Wagner Group was sent to protect. President Nicolas Maduro had run the country into the ground and let violence run rampant in the streets. Corruption filled almost every part of the government, and the citizens of Venezuela were suffering greatly. However, Maduro was running against a US-backed candidate who Russia most certainly did not want to win the election. The Wagner Group was also sent to keep an eye on Russian business interests, such as Rosneft, an oil company that was making large sums of money off the natural resources in the country. Once again, the Wagner Group's presence in a foreign nation was the direct result of Russia trying to influence politics and secure resources. The Wagner Group also trained the Venezuelan national military and the pro-Maduro colectivos, which would keep politicians who were sympathetic to Russian causes in power. When asked about the connection between Russian interests and the Wagner Group, the Russian ambassador to Venezuela, Vladimir Zaemsky, told the press that the Wagner Group wasn't in the country, even though photos and videos of them had already been circulating. In Libya, the Wagner Group was sent by Russia to aid General Khalifa Haftar, where they were accused of planting landmines, a weapon which more than 150 countries have banned. Landmines are incredibly dangerous because they're active long after a conflict is over, and it was a safe bet that the Wagner Group wasn't going to clean up the leftover ordnance. Landmines that mercenaries planted in Libya and other parts of Africa, such as the Central African Republic, have detonated, killing or severely injuring innocent civilians, including children. But the Wagner Group doesn't care who they hurt as long as they get paid. Russia refuses to acknowledge its ties to the Wagner Group, but they still foot most of the bills, such as their transportation and weapons. It's highly probable that Putin's government even pays some of the Wagner Group's salaries. The deployment of landmines is not the only condemnable act the Wagner Group has engaged in. The United Nations have accused the Wagner Group of murdering, robbing, and physically harming civilians wherever they go. This brings us to the present day. Perhaps there's no more blatant connection between Putin and the Wagner Group than what has happened in the war against Ukraine. Weeks before Putin launched his invasion, the Wagner Group flew 400 mercenaries from the Central African Republic to Ukraine to assassinate President Volodymyr Zelensky. They obviously failed, but it was very clear once the war got underway who hired them to carry out such an act. The Wagner mercenaries also launched a series of false flag operations that Putin later used to justify his invasion of Ukraine. Basically, the Wagner Group was the first Russian force to wage war against Ukraine, and true to form, these mercenaries almost immediately began committing brutal acts of terror. In March of 2022, Russian forces along with a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries captured the city of Bucha, Ukraine, just to the northwest of Kyiv. Radio communications were intercepted that indicated the execution of civilians was a main part of Russia's plan to instill fear in the population. The Wagner Group had a lot of experience in these types of terror tactics, so it's possible they led the charge for what would become known as the Bucha massacre. When the Ukrainian army pushed Russian forces out of the region, they were horrified at what they found in Bucha. 458 bodies of Ukrainian citizens were found. 419 of them had been killed with weapons, including 9 children under the age of 18. It was an unbearable sight, but the world had to know what Russia and the Wagner Group had done. At least 50 people had been executed with their hands bound behind their backs and gunshot wounds from point-blank range to the head. Upon further investigation, it was found the soldiers and mercenaries who carried out these acts of cruelty also tortured people in the basements beneath the campground. Bodies were found mutilated or with burn marks all over. War crimes and crimes against humanity were committed in Bucha, and there is very little doubt that the Wagner Group played at least some role in what happened there. This is nothing new, as we now know. The Wagner Group consistently uses terror tactics and brutality during their missions. However, like the Russian military, the number of mercenaries in the Wagner Group is decreasing due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. This is why reports coming out of Russia indicate the Wagner Group is recruiting thousands of convicts from prisons across the country to join their organization. At this point, both the Wagner Group and the Russian military will take anybody they can get their hands on. Putin is forcing Russian citizens to fight in the war effort, but it would be a bad look for him if he started putting convicts on the front lines. However, since he claims the Wagner Group has no affiliation with the Russian government, they're allowed to recruit anyone they want. Some U.S. officials have suggested that due to the Wagner Group's recruiting efforts, it might have as many as 50,000 men in their organization. It's estimated by the UK that at the height of the invasion, around 10% of Russian forces consisted of Wagner Group mercenaries. Ukrainian soldiers have noted these men are not well trained or equipped for battle, as they often attack across open ground, which allows snipers and infantry to easily pick them off. It almost seems as if Putin's using Wagner mercenaries as cannon fodder in some parts of Ukraine. This might not be too far from the truth, as Russia doesn't have to count independently contracted soldiers as casualties when assessing how the war effort is going. It looks a lot better for Putin if thousands of mercenaries are dying rather than thousands of Russian soldiers. But the delusional Russian dictator isn't fooling anyone. The world knows that he indirectly controls the Wagner Group and is using them to enhance the number of soldiers he has in Ukraine. He's also likely using the men in the organization to commit heinous acts against the Ukrainian people to instill fear, while distancing himself and the Kremlin from these crimes against humanity. The Wagner Group is a company that shouldn't exist. Its sole purpose is to carry out the desires of Putin and his allies, so they can't be held accountable. But being a member of the Wagner Group means that you do what you're told no matter what. Videos have been released of former members of the organization being executed for desertion. One ex-fighter named Yevgeny Nushkin was killed for treason by a sledgehammer to the head. Like Vladimir Putin, the Wagner Group is brutal, insane, and needs to be brought to justice. Failure, humiliation, death. That's what Vladimir Putin faces if Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful. Right now, Putin's propaganda machine is working overtime to manipulate the Russian public's perception of the war. The Kremlin is pumping out disinformation that the Ukrainian offensive is being crushed, the Russian economy is strong, and that troop morale has never been higher. All of these things are lies. But Putin needs to convincingly paint this picture of himself and the state of Russian affairs, because if he doesn't and the Ukrainian counteroffensive succeeds, it will be the end of his life. Vladimir Putin is scared, and he should be, because the Ukrainian military has superior training, weaponry, and vehicles when compared to his conscript army that is currently mounting a defense of the Zaporizhia Oblast region of Ukraine. Over the winter and spring months, Russia's been digging trenches and constructing fortifications along the 621 miles or 1,000-kilometer front line in preparation for this very moment. Ukraine has begun its offensive. But unlike what Russia did at the beginning of the war, its military leadership is taking calculated risks and relying on reconnaissance and intel to make informed decisions. When Russia launched its invasion, Putin ordered a full-on attack with massive amounts of tanks, artillery, and troops. Since you're watching this video right now, Russia's plans to overwhelm Ukraine's forces and to be welcomed into the country by the Ukrainian people obviously failed. Instead, the Kremlin's hasty attack and outdated tactics led to Ukrainian forces destroying and capturing over 2,001 tanks since the beginning of the war. Over 500 of those tanks were captured and repurposed by the Ukrainians, which meant while Russia's tank numbers were dwindling, Ukraine's were growing. These numbers have been supplemented by the delivery of 21 Leopard 2 tanks from Germany, with more modern tanks on their way. Instead of using the Russian tactic of throwing everything they've got at an enemy with no real plan of attack and hoping for the best, Ukraine is falling back on its NATO training and continued success of designing well-planned operations with a flexible command structure to maximize their smaller numbers. In terms of the counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces have been probing Russian defenses in order to locate weak spots that can be exploited. The Ukrainian forces are using UAVs to gather intel and falling back on their knowledge of the landscape to identify areas where they can break through enemy lines. It's only a matter of time before the Russians either make a mistake or leave an area unguarded, at which point Ukrainian tanks and troops will plow through their defenses. When this happens, Putin will be in big trouble. He's managed to keep the Russian people in the dark by controlling the media within his borders. Putin already ordered the conscription of around 250,000 men in 2022 and another 147,000 men in the spring of 2023. And if Russia needs to initiate another round of conscription to replenish the number of soldiers lost during the Ukrainian offensive, it's going to make Putin look really bad. There's also the fact that the Kremlin will need to explain away how the Ukrainians got past their supposedly impenetrable defenses and continue to punish the Russian military. However, there is one aspect of the offensive that could be the final nail in the coffin for Vladimir Putin, and this is what he is most afraid of. We're going to lay out each aspect that Putin is shaking in his boots for shortly. But first, let's look at what type of defense Russia has created and what is actually standing in the way of the Ukrainian victory and Putin's demise. Russia has deployed minefields, concrete tank obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth, artillery impact zones, and trenches across southern Ukraine. The problem that the Ukrainian offensive faces is that Russia has had time to create a multi-layered defense structure that consists of static defenses, motorized rifle battalions, and artillery. Each battalion is responsible for an area approximately 3 to 5 kilometers wide and 2 to 2.5 kilometers deep. This works out to be around 4 square miles. For the past several weeks, Ukrainian artillery and missiles have been striking targets far behind the front lines to disrupt the Russian command structure and logistical capabilities. Simultaneously, Ukrainian ground forces are conducting reconnaissance missions with small groups of armored vehicles and tanks to locate entry points through the Russian defenses. This has resulted in the loss of around 16 armored vehicles and 1 Leopard 2 tank. But these are calculated risks that provide the Ukrainian military leaders with vital information that can be used when a full-on offensive is launched. The Russian defenses are set up in 4 stages in most areas, with deep trenches and ditches dug first to slow Ukrainian tanks and vehicles down, followed by concrete Dragon's Teeth. Beyond these first 2 defenses are infantry trenches where Russian soldiers with anti-tank weapons and rocket-propelled grenades wait. The final defense is another trench where Russian commanders are located. This final series of trenches can also be used for Russian soldiers to fall back to in case they need to retreat. The goal of these defenses isn't necessarily to stop Ukrainian forces, but to slow them down. This is because they become easy targets for the Russian artillery located much further away from the front lines. This could decimate an entire Ukrainian force, which is why they're spending time conducting reconnaissance missions to identify the best locations to cross through Russian defenses. This means that Putin is anxiously waiting for what comes next. He is watching closely, as he's likely fully aware that the Russian defenses are full of vulnerabilities. It's been found that many of the defensive features in Ukraine were dug and built by contractors who had little to no military engineering experience. This lack of expertise has led to fortifications that are inadequate for repelling modern Western tanks and well-trained Ukrainian soldiers. Recent photos have shown that some of Russia's Dragon's Teeth have been improperly set up, likely due to the lack of training or military knowledge of the contractors. Dragon's Teeth should be connected to one another underground and also partially buried. Instead, some of these features are just sitting on top of loosely packed dirt. Also, several strands of Dragon's Teeth have already begun falling apart due to environmental factors. This means that they likely won't be able to withstand the weight of tanks and armored vehicles when Ukrainian forces push forward. Knowing that there are clear weak points in Russia's defenses has Putin pulling his hair out. At least he would if he had any. Instead, the Russian dictator is trying to brainstorm ways to spin the inadequacies of the Russian military to keep the general public on his side. But all the propaganda in the world will not save him if the Ukrainian offensive is successful, and the reasons why are pretty straightforward. Number 1. A successful Ukrainian offensive will highlight the inadequacies of the Russian military and Putin's rule. At this point in time, around 98% of combat vehicles and weapons promised to Ukraine have been delivered. Notably, dozens of modern tanks have still not made it to Ukraine but are on their way, such as around 80 Leopard 2s from European countries and 31 M1 Abrams from the US. However, with around 1,550 armored vehicles and approximately 230 tanks being delivered from Western nations, Ukraine has approximately 950 tanks and over 2,000 armored vehicles ready to launch their offensive. Ukrainian forces have also been receiving training from NATO on how to use the Leopard 2 tanks and offensive strategies since the beginning of the war. While this was happening, Russian conscripts received little to no training and instead were handed a gun, shipped to the front lines, and told to dig trenches during the brutal winter months in Ukraine. This not only means that the Russian troops defending the front lines have had little idea of what they're doing, they're also demoralized, resulting in a number of AWOL cases. In fact, the number of soldiers that went AWOL in the first 4 months of 2023 exceeded the total number of cases in 2022. This must make Putin nervous because he is quickly running out of reserves to replenish the number of men he has on the front lines. Putin's plan right now is to wage a war of attrition in the hopes that Russia's superior numbers and vast natural resources will allow his forces to last long enough for Western nations to lose interest in helping Ukraine. And to be fair, this wouldn't be the first time that NATO or the West started something that they didn't finish. In fact, this very scenario happened in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea, and the West condemned his actions but sat idly by while Ukraine's land was stolen. If Russia's defenses are deep enough and its superior numbers can hold out against the Ukrainian offensive, then Putin can continue his war of attrition for many years if need be. That being said, this plan will only work if the Ukrainian forces can be stopped, which is seeming more and more unlikely. And it's because of this fact that Putin is very afraid of what is to come in the summer months. Number 2. The Ukrainian offensive could erase everything that Russia has done since the beginning of the invasion, which would make Putin look weak. The offensive could signal the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. At the start of the war, most of the Russian people supported the invasion and reclaiming Ukraine as a Russian territory. However, this was when taking Ukraine seemed like an easy victory. Now that the war has continued into its second year with no end in sight, the Russian people are beginning to question Vladimir Putin's leadership. This is terrifying for the dictator, but things will only get worse if the Ukrainian counteroffensive is successful. To put how badly the war is going into perspective, it's estimated that around 475 days into the war in Ukraine, the Russian army has lost more than 178,000 soldiers. This is 12.7 times more than were lost in both Chechen wars, where Russia suffered 14,000 casualties. The number of men killed or wounded in Ukraine is also around 11.8 times more than the Soviet army lost in the 9 years of the war in Afghanistan, where they sustained approximately 15,000 casualties. If the offensive is successful, supply routes that run from Russia through eastern Ukraine will be lost. This will make resupplying Russian troops in southern Ukraine much more difficult, and as Russian soldiers become less well-equipped and demoralized, Ukrainian forces will gain more of an upper hand. This will lead to a snowball effect where Russian troops are pushed further and further south. Without the supply lines running through eastern Ukraine, Russia will have to commit more resources to airdropping equipment into southern Ukraine or taking the much longer route through Crimea. If Ukrainian forces break through the front line, encircle Russian soldiers, and force them to retreat further south, it'll also mean that Ukraine has reclaimed all of the land Russia invaded back in February of 2022. This does not include Crimea, which we'll talk about in a bit, but what this does mean is that the invasion would officially become a total failure. If Ukraine can push Russian forces all the way to the land bridge between Crimea and southern Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will have nothing to show for a year and a half of fighting. This will lead to the oligarchs, other prominent Russian leaders, and the general public to question Putin's rule. It'll be incredibly hard to spin the Ukrainian offensive as a failure if they reclaim all the territory Russia invaded, which is why Putin is terrified of what could happen in the coming months. However, most analysts suspect that Ukraine won't take back all of the territory in the Zaporizhia region right away, but at least will secure a large portion of the area. Even this could be enough to oust Putin, depending on how angry the Russian people and elites get at their loss of their countrymen in Putin's pointless war. Number 3. If the Ukrainian offensive is successful, it could threaten Russia's control over Crimea. This is Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare. Putin's biggest fear is losing Crimea. This is because he built and sold his dreams of a new Russian empire on the foundation of annexing Crimea in 2014. This event served as the backbone for everything that was to come and the invasion of the rest of Ukraine in 2022. What this means is if the Ukrainian offensive reaches Crimea, it would be a tragedy for Vladimir Putin. This is probably the one outcome of the offensive that Putin is most scared of. But the craziest part is that Ukraine doesn't even need to take Crimea during the offensive. All they need to do is get close, and Vladimir Putin's power will begin to dissolve. It should come as no surprise that the most alarming proposition for any dictator is appearing weak. To most of the world, Putin already looks weak. But if the Ukrainian counteroffensive pushes Russian forces all the way back to Crimea, the Russian president will be seen as weak by the Russian people. This is not something he can afford, and it could very well lead to the end of his time in power or even his life. During the winter months, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared, "Crimea is our land, our territory," to the world. This contradicts the rhetoric that Putin has spewed to the Russian people for years. Those words also likely instilled fear into Putin as it became clear that the Ukrainian offensive in the summer months could target the Crimean Peninsula. However, Ukraine doesn't need to take Crimea in order to hurt Putin. On top of losing all the land that Russia invaded, a successful offensive would allow Ukraine to blockade the Crimean Peninsula, a proposition that would slowly whittle away any remaining control Putin has over the region. There is no doubt that retaking Crimea by force would be incredibly costly for the Ukrainian military. Thousands of lives would be lost, and the infrastructure of the peninsula would be decimated. If Ukraine tries to take Crimea by force, there would likely be no clear winner. However, they don't necessarily have to launch a military campaign on the peninsula to hurt Putin. The narrow land bridge that connects Crimea to the rest of Ukraine serves as a choke point where artillery and Russian defenses could hold back pretty much anything Ukraine throws at them. But the same can be said about keeping Russian supplies and reinforcements out of Crimea as well. There are only two entry points into Crimea from the mainland. One is from southern Ukraine, the other is from western Russia. A successful offensive would allow Ukraine to cut off Russian access to Crimea from the Zaporizhia Oblast. To cut off supplies and military shipments being sent via the Black Sea or the Sea of Azov, Ukraine could use uncrewed surface vessels or USVs to intercept ships or attack them at Sevastopol. This would be done by packing a USV with explosives and sending it on a kamikaze mission to blow a hole in the hulls of Russian ships. This is a relatively simple and low-cost strategy that could result in serious disruptions to the Russian naval supply lines in Crimea. The USVs could also be used to lay mines at port entrances as another way to sever Russian supply routes. Basically, rather than losing Crimea to a Ukrainian attack, Putin has to worry about losing it to a Ukrainian siege. Ukraine has already attacked the Crimean bridge connecting Russia to Crimea at least once and caused massive damage. So after the offensive takes back the land across the Sea of Azov, launching future attacks on the bridge will be even easier. This means there would be virtually no way to get resources or troops to Crimea except by plane, and aircraft can only deliver a fraction of the supplies that ground vehicles and ships can. Also, if NATO ever sends Ukraine F-16s that they promised, it would pretty much be game over for Russia in Ukraine. The proposition of Crimea eventually falling or slowly crumbling due to a Ukrainian blockade must be eating away at Putin. Every day that passes where Ukrainian forces probe the front lines brings them that much closer to advancing toward Crimea. When this happens, Putin may suffer a heart attack from the stress of watching his dreams of a Russian empire slowly slip away as the Russian people and leadership begin to turn against him. To be clear, reaching Crimea even once the Ukrainian offensive gets going will not be easy. However, if things continue to go in the favor of Ukraine, as they did just before the winter hiatus, Putin could be in big trouble. And as we mentioned before, losing Crimea is Putin's biggest fear. He'll do anything to prevent Ukraine from regaining control of Crimea, even if it means putting the entire world on the brink of all-out war. Because it's clear that if Crimea falls, Putin will fall too. Thus far, there hasn't been a serious push to penetrate the Russian line, but Putin, like the rest of the world, knows it's coming. This has probably led to a lot of sleepless nights and discussions about what to do if the Ukrainian offensive succeeds. When Ukrainian forces push through, Putin will be left with two options. The first is to negotiate some kind of peace. The problem is that Ukraine will not even entertain the idea of peace talks unless it involves Russia completely withdrawing from its territory, including Crimea. Since this isn't an option for Putin due to the fact that he'd end up being ousted from power, it leaves option 2, escalation. If Putin sits idly by while the Ukrainian offensive drives his forces further and further back toward Crimea, it'll only be a matter of time until Ukraine is in a position to blockade the peninsula or gather more support from Western nations to take back the territory. Vladimir Putin knows he cannot allow this to happen, so his only option will be to escalate things in the hope that he can either stop Ukraine's advancement or have the international community step in and force Ukraine to come to the negotiating table. Unfortunately for Putin, the West is tired of cowering to Russia's escalation rhetoric and has shown through their support of Ukraine that they no longer fear Vladimir Putin. There are 2 ways that Putin could escalate the conflict. The first is by conscripting more Russians and throwing another wave of troops at Ukraine. The Wagner group, made up of mercenaries for hire and former inmates, is already recruiting more men to their organization to help combat the Ukrainian offensive. UK military intelligence has recently reported that there are approximately 50,000 Wagner Group mercenaries in Ukraine at the moment. The conscription option would be done at a great cost to the Russian people. But Putin may hope that by throwing wave after wave of troops at Ukraine, he'll be able to wear them down and eventually claim victory. The other way Putin could escalate the conflict is by putting nuclear weapons back on the table. If Putin is backed into a corner and all of his worst fears come true, he may be willing to risk the safety of the planet in order to maintain power. Deploying nukes, either tactical or strategic, and threatening to use them may be enough to stop the Ukrainian offensive. However, NATO and the international community would come down hard on the Russian dictator if he chooses this option. In fact, even Russia's most powerful partner, China, would almost certainly not support Putin in his decision to use nukes. This option would literally turn much of the world against Russia, which would then result in Putin either being stripped of power or suffering from a mysterious set of deadly circumstances. The terrifying thing for the rest of the world is that if Ukraine's offensive is successful and Putin resorts to escalation with nukes, then nobody will win. But this is the crux of the problem. Putin's fear of the Ukrainian offensive is warranted because throughout the war, Ukraine has exceeded everyone's expectations. Ukraine successfully defended its capital from the initial invasion. They pushed Russian forces almost completely out of their territory, and they managed to come out victorious against a much larger army. These facts mean that the offensive will likely go well for Ukraine, which terrifies Putin. There are also around 600,000 Russian settlers in Crimea and Russian collaborators in the Donbass that would need to escape the incoming Ukrainian forces if they managed to break through the Russian defenses. It's unlikely that Putin would spare any men or resources to ensure that these people reach safety, which could mean that many Russians still in Ukraine may be facing angry Ukrainian soldiers on their own. If this happens, there could be an outcry from the Russian people, and a popular movement to remove Putin from power could arise. So, no matter what Vladimir Putin does, he'll find himself in a precarious position. His goal right now is to continue this war of attrition that Russia has been waging ever since its initial invasion failed. They cannot defeat the superior Ukrainian tactics and newly acquired equipment from the West. However, Russia still has a massive amount of men and resources at its disposal, since Vladimir Putin controls pretty much every industry and individual within Russia's borders. Using his reserves and conscripting more men might lead to an eventual ceasefire as Ukraine's forces get closer to Crimea, but don't have the manpower or resources to make the final push. This would give Putin the time to recruit more soldiers and dust off more ancient equipment from the early Soviet era. Left to his own devices, Putin will never stop throwing men at the war effort until he can enter negotiations that will favor him, or by some miracle, his forces manage to secure some kind of victory, prolonging the war even more. This could actually be the end goal for Vladimir Putin. He might be trying to wait everyone out until circumstances are in his favor, even though this doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon. Putin is now afraid that if the offensive pushes his forces further back, it'll be difficult to convince the elites and the public that there was any victory to be had at all, which is why he's vying for more time. What it comes down to is that Vladimir Putin is terrified of the Ukrainian offensive because a loss at this stage could be the final straw for the Russian people. The majority who wanted to seize Ukraine now only want peace. The Russian people are suffering, and they're beginning to blame Putin. During the offensive, we'll probably see Ukrainian forces push through Russian defenses and take back at least some of the land that Russia currently controls. This will not be the end of the war, but it could signal the end of Vladimir Putin. The dictator is currently hoping that by utilizing Russia's sheer numbers, he can prolong the war until the West loses interest or stops sending Ukraine support. At that point, he can probably negotiate a far more favorable outcome for himself. Russia has a population of around 3 times the size of Ukraine's, meaning that there are still hundreds of thousands of men who can be conscripted into military service. Putin isn't afraid to lose more men, but he is afraid that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will reach Crimea, and at that point, Putin's life would be put in jeopardy. Now watch ex-CIA agent breaks down why Putin is in trouble, or check out real reason Russia gave Crimea to Ukraine.